Welcome to Sleepless Historian, where medieval life is told not with noise and numbers, but in a quiet voice, like a memory shared beside the fire. Here, history slows down. It breathes. It waits for you to listen. Tonight, we'll leave behind the crowns and crusades to follow a single woman's story, because sometimes one life lived in silence can reveal more about the Middle Ages than any king's chronicle. Hers is a world of frost-bitten mornings, whispered prayers, and forbidden knowledge. A world where kindness could be mistaken for witchcraft, and survival itself became a form of courage. So find your calm. Let the night settle around you. As you listen, you might discover that medieval life wasn't only about struggle, it was also about the small, stubborn acts of hope that kept people alive. And if this gentle way of wandering through the past helps you rest, or if you'd like more quiet stories from Sleepless Historian, you're welcome to stay. Subscribe, settle in, and let history lull you towards sleep. Religious belief and power. Religion in the Middle Ages was not simply a private faith. It was the air people breathed the law that bound communities together and the authority that defined what was real. To understand why medieval society believed orgasm could be a cure, we must first see how the church and its leaders framed the female body. In their teachings, women were both necessary and dangerous, and necessary for reproduction, yet dangerous because desire and bodily pleasure were linked with sin. Every sigh or shudder could be reinterpreted as the whisper of the devil, a reminder that Eve's original sin still lingered in the flesh of her daughters. The Church, as the arbiter of truth, from the 5th century through the late Middle Ages, the Catholic Church established itself as the supreme interpreter of the natural and spiritual world. Priests controlled access to the written word. Monasteries were the centres of learning. Sermons provided moral frameworks for entire villages. For ordinary people who could not read the priest's interpretation of Scripture was the only truth they knew. Within this framework, women were warned constantly about the dangers of their bodies. Clerical texts described the female body as leaky, unstable, prone to temptation, and in need of regulation. This was not merely theology, it was lived reality. Laws about marriage, sexuality, and even medical care were filtered through the Church's teachings, the language of sin and desire. In medieval sermons, pleasure was rarely mentioned without sin. St. Augustine's writings were particularly influential. He argued that sexual pleasure was the mark of humanity's fallen state, a sign that desire had broken free from rational control. Later, theologians reinforced this idea, teaching that female pleasure was doubly dangerous, first, because it inflamed lust in men, and second, because it suggested women were closer to the devil's whispers. To enjoy the body was in essence to betray the soul. Thus, when women expressed physical reactions, crying out, trembling, sighing, the Church had a ready explanation. They were either possessed or dangerously close to sin. A striking example comes from penitential manuals, which were guides for confessors. These manuals asked priests to question women about their sexual behavior in intrusive detail. A woman who admitted to feeling desire could be told to fast to recite dozens of prayers or to undergo public penance. The body itself was policed through the language of sin. To be healed, a woman had to admit guilt, not simply illness. Exorcism as a form of medicine. Because the Church saw demons in natural reactions, it developed rituals of exorcism that doubled as medical cures. For instance, if a woman fainted or shook uncontrollably, priests might declare that a spirit had entered her womb. The solution was to surround her with relics chant prayers, and sprinkle holy water until she collapsed in exhaustion. When she recovered often just from physical fatigue, her improvement was credited to the ritual. One case recorded in a 13th century monastic chronicle describes a young woman in Saxony who repeatedly lost consciousness. Her family brought her to the local priest, who locked her in the church for 3 nights of prayer and exorcism. Each time her body shuddered, the priest declared victory over a demon. Yet historians now believe she may have simply suffered from seizures. What mattered to medieval witnesses was not the cause, but the spectacle. The church turned ordinary ailments into proof of spiritual warfare, reinforcing its authority as the gatekeeper of healing, marriage as a religious cure. The church also promoted marriage as a cure for female disorder. A husband, guided by religious duty, was told to regulate his wife's body. If a woman expressed too much desire, it was his responsibility to keep her in check. If she expressed too little, it was his task to remedy her condition through intercourse. This transformed marriage into a medical prescription. Priests even advised young widows to remarry quickly, lest their uncontrolled bodies bring scandal. In this way, personal health became inseparable from religious authority. An example appears in the writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and visionary. While Hildegard was unusually sympathetic to women's experiences, even she described the female body as unruly, without the guiding hand of marriage or the discipline of monastic life. Her mystical visions explained illnesses as spiritual imbalances corrected only through prayer and obedience. In Hildegard's worldview, women could find healing only by submitting to divine order, whether through God or through their husbands, controlling knowledge. The monopoly on learning further strengthened the church's hold. Because women were rarely allowed to study Latin, they were excluded from the language of medicine and theology. Men wrote the texts, men copied them, and men taught them. Women's lived experiences were filtered through male authority before they could be recorded. When female midwives practiced healing with herbs or massage, their knowledge circulated orally in secret outside the written tradition. This secrecy made them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. By labeling women's remedies as dangerous while canonizing priests' rituals as holy, the church reinforced a hierarchy. Women's knowledge was superstition, while clerical practice was truth. Consider the case of Trotula of Salerno, one of the few women whose medical writings survived. She offered practical advice for women's health recipes, for easing childbirth pains, treatments for menstrual disorders. But later scribes often changed her texts, attributing them to male authors or adjusting passages that acknowledged female pleasure. The erasure of women's voices from the medical canon shows how tightly the church and its allies controlled discourse. Fear as a tool of authority. Fear was not incidental, it was essential. Villagers were reminded in every sermon that sin lurked in their desires, that the devil could tempt through the body, and that only the church could offer protection. Women were the most visible targets of this fear. When a woman moaned in pain or relief, it was easy for witnesses to imagine demons. Fear of scandal meant families brought their daughters and wives to priests rather than trusting their own judgment. Fear silenced women from speaking about their needs. Fear allowed priests to define healing in ways that reinforced their power. For example, during the Inquisition, confessions about sexual desire were twisted into evidence of witchcraft. A woman who admitted to seeking pleasure could be accused of consorting with demons. Even outside witch trials, everyday parish life was steeped in warnings. Statues of Eve, with the serpent, were displayed in churches as constant reminders of female weakness. Children grew up seeing their mothers associated with original sin. This climate made it nearly impossible for women to claim authority over their bodies. The legacy of guilt. The cumulative effect of these teachings was a deep association between female desire and guilt. Women were taught to see their own sensations as dangerous. Relief, even when achieved naturally, was reinterpreted as divine correction or the result of priestly rituals. Silence became a survival strategy. Generations of women passed down lessons of caution: do not speak, do not trust your body, do not claim pleasure. In this way, the Church's teachings outlived the Middle Ages, shaping attitudes about sexuality well into the modern era laws and regulations as tools of control. Religious belief in the Middle Ages did not remain abstract. It was encoded into law. Canon law, the legal system of the Church, established strict guidelines about marriage, sexuality, and health. A woman could not choose freely when or whether to marry. The Church dictated marriage as a sacrament binding not just two individuals, but entire families under its supervision. Marital sex was permissible, but only for reproduction. To enjoy it for pleasure was labelled sinful, a perversion of God's plan. In this way, female desire was written into law as something dangerous. A notable example can be found in the penitentials of the 10th and 11th centuries. These handbooks for confessors catalogued sins and their penances. Women who confessed to seeking pleasure during intercourse might be told to fast for 40 days. In extreme cases, they were ordered to abstain from communion, a punishment that publicly marked them as spiritually unclean. This was not just about faith. It was a system of social regulation. By controlling the language of confession, priests controlled women's behavior at the most intimate level, rituals that reframed natural responses. The Church also redefined natural physical responses as signs of spiritual struggle. Trembling during childbirth, fainting from pain or sighing during healing rituals were not seen as natural, but as evidence of possession. Priests claimed that demons exploited women's bodily weakness, and only the Church's sacraments could drive them out. This logic turned ordinary healthcare into public ritual. Take the case of childbirth. Women often delivered in the presence of midwives, but priests were called when complications arose. In some regions, holy water was sprinkled on the mother's abdomen to expel demons hindering birth. If she cried out in relief when labour ended, her reaction could be proclaimed a triumph of God's power, not her body's endurance. In effect, women's strength was erased from the story, replaced with narratives that glorified religious authority. The spectacle of possession. One of the most powerful tools of the Church was spectacle. Exorcisms were often performed in public, transforming private suffering into community drama. A woman trembling on the ground became proof of spiritual warfare. The priest, by chanting and commanding, emerged as the hero. The crowd's fear and awe reinforced clerical authority. This dynamic can be seen in medieval miracle plays, where actors portrayed demons entering women and priests, triumphantly casting them out. Such performances blurred theatre and ritual teaching entire communities to interpret female suffering as demonic. For instance, records from 14th century France describe women brought before congregations to force to endure hours of chanting and sprinkling with holy water until they collapsed. Their exhaustion was read as healing. The point was not whether the woman recovered, but whether the crowd witnessed the Church's power. These spectacles shaped cultural memory, embedding the idea that women's bodies were battlegrounds between good and evil. Case study: demoniac women. Historians have uncovered specific cases of demoniac women whose symptoms, convulsions, trances, ecstatic cries were treated as evidence of possession. In many cases, scholars now believe these women suffered from epilepsy, mental illness, or trauma. Yet the Church's interpretation prevailed. In Germany, a woman named Agnes was confined to a convent after violent convulsions. Priests described her as writhing like a serpent, proof that the devil resided in her womb. She underwent years of exorcisms each session, reinforcing her reputation as cursed. To her community, Agnes was not a patient, but a symbol. Her suffering validated the Church's teachings, the role of monastic writers. Monastic authors also shaped how society interpreted women. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, published slightly later in 1487, built on centuries of clerical suspicion, portraying women as more susceptible to the devil because of their supposed insatiable lust. Though technically late medieval, the ideas echoed earlier sermons and treatises. By defining women as spiritually weak, these texts justified invasive practices. A priest examining a woman's body could claim he was fighting demons. What might appear exploitative was reframed as holy duty. Midwives under suspicion. While male clerics monopolized written medicine, midwives continued their oral traditions. They used herbs, oils, and massage to comfort women. Yet because they worked outside church authority, they were viewed with suspicion. Accusations of witchcraft often targeted midwives precisely because they offered women an alternative form of care. If a woman felt relief after a midwife's touch, it threatened the Church's monopoly. Better to label it sorcery than to admit women had knowledge of their own bodies. One chilling example comes from records of the Bishop of Basel, who in the 15th century condemned several midwives for using incantations during childbirth. Their words may have been simple prayers or comforting chants, but to the authorities, any unsanctioned ritual was heresy. These trials reveal how even kindness could be reframed as danger when it bypassed clerical authority. Language as domination. Language itself became a form of control. Priests rebranded female orgasm as purification cleansing or release of humours. By renaming pleasure, they erased women's ability to claim it. To speak truthfully was to risk punishment. If a woman said she felt relief, she was told she had experienced divine correction. If she admitted joy, it became evidence of sin. This manipulation of language ensured that women's voices could not disrupt the clerical narrative. Consider the theological debates over virginity. Female saints were praised for renouncing pleasure, their bodies described as sealed vessels of holiness. In contrast, ordinary women who expressed desire were compared to Eve, dangerous and corrupt. By creating these categories, the Church silenced the majority of women who lived between extremes, neither saints nor whores, but ordinary people with ordinary needs. Broader cultural effects. The Church's teachings shaped not only medical practice, but also art, literature, and folklore. Illuminated manuscripts depicted women tormented by demons, while male saints triumphed through prayer. Popular tales warned of women who fell sick because they resisted confession only to be healed once they obeyed. These stories circulated widely, teaching generations to see female suffering as moral failure. Even music carried the message. Hymns described the Virgin Mary as pure precisely because she was untouched by desire. In contrast, other women were measured against this impossible standard, lasting legacy. The legacy of these beliefs was silence. Women learned to endure quietly, to reinterpret their own sensations through the lens of guilt. Relief was never theirs. It was granted by priests or husbands. Knowledge of their bodies was hidden, passed only in whispers between mothers and daughters. The association between female desire and sin persisted long after the medieval period, shaping attitudes into the Renaissance and beyond. Even today, echoes remain in the way societies struggle to speak openly about female sexuality. The concept of the wandering womb, a strange theory. Among the strangest ideas in medieval medicine was the belief that the womb could move freely inside a woman's body. Known as the theory of the wandering womb, this concept had deep roots in ancient medicine, stretching back to Greek authors like Hippocrates and Galen, but it was reshaped by the spiritual framework of the Middle Ages. To medieval physicians and clerics, the womb was not simply an organ, it was a restless creature capable of roaming the body, suffocating the lungs, or pressing against the brain. Every fainting spell, sudden pain, or fit of hysteria could be explained by this mysterious wandering organ. This belief did not remain abstract. It justified treatments that ranged from the bizarre to the invasive burning herbs near women's faces or feet to lure the womb back into place, forcing women to inhale pungent fumes, massaging their abdomens, or even subjecting them to sexual intercourse framed as a cure. To understand how orgasm became a medicine, we must first explore how the wandering womb shaped medical, religious, and cultural attitudes. Ancient roots of the theory. The origins of the wandering womb go back to the 5th century BCE. Greek physicians described the womb as a living animal inside the body. If neglected, if a woman remained unmarried, childless, or celibate, the womb supposedly grew restless. Like a serpent seeking food, it wandered through the body in search of satisfaction. Plato in Timaeus described the uterus as a creature with a will of its own. When deprived of intercourse, it would wander in distress, causing suffocation and madness. Later, Galen offered a humoral explanation, claiming that imbalances of fluids caused the womb's movements. When these texts were translated into Latin and Arabic and reintroduced into medieval Europe, they carried with them centuries of authority. Medieval scholars trained in monasteries and universities accepted ancient wisdom as near sacred truth. The wandering womb became not only a medical concept, but also a cultural metaphor. Women were unstable because their most intimate organ was unstable. Adoption in medieval medicine. By the 12th and 13th centuries, universities in places like Bologna and Paris taught medical texts that described the womb as unpredictable. Students, almost all male, learned that female health depended on keeping the womb anchored. Manuals of gynecology warned that widows, virgins, or nuns were especially vulnerable because lack of sexual activity made the womb restless. Fainting spells, convulsions, and anxiety were all explained by this theory. For example, the Trotula, a famous medieval compendium of women's medicine, attributed to the female physician Trotta of Salerno, but later edited by men, included remedies for uterine suffocation. Treatments involved fumigation with herbs, strong-smelling oils, and baths. If these failed, the prescription was intercourse with a husband, an explicit example of how medicine reinforced patriarchy by making marriage and sex a woman's supposed cure. Treatments and rituals. The remedies for a wandering womb reveal much about medieval attitudes toward the female body. Physicians and midwives recommended fumigation, burning herbs like rue sage or mugwort under a woman's chair, directing the smoke toward her genitals. The goal was to lure the womb back downward with pleasant smells. Inhalation of foul odours. To drive the womb away from the chest or head, women were forced to inhale rancid smoke or animal hair set on fire. The discomfort was considered proof that the womb was moving. Abdominal massage. Midwives massaged the belly with warm oils, guiding the womb back to its proper place. Intercourse as medicine. Texts often recommended marital sex as the ultimate cure, reinforcing the idea that women's health depended on male control. These treatments blurred the line between healing and ritual. When women trembled, moaned, or even reached orgasm under these procedures, physicians declared success. Relief was interpreted not as natural bodily function, but as medical correction, religious framing of the womb. The Church adopted and adapted the wandering womb theory to its own worldview. Priests described the womb as a seat of temptation, a place where demons could enter. Just as the serpent had tempted Eve, so too could the womb tempt women into sin. Exorcism rituals were sometimes combined with medical treatments, fumigation with herbs, accompanied by prayers, massages, paired with blessings. A woman's sighs or cries were reframed as evidence that evil was leaving her body. In this way, physical reactions were sanctified as spiritual victories. One recorded case from a convent in 14th century Italy describes a nun who suffered fainting spells. Physicians declared her womb had risen to her chest. The abbess called in both a doctor and a priest. While the doctor prepared herbal smoke, the priest sprinkled holy water and recited exorcisms. When the nun gasped and trembled, both men proclaimed their methods successful. Her own voice was absent from the record. Only the interpretations of male authority remained. Social implications. The wandering womb theory had powerful consequences for how women were seen in society. Justification for marriage, widows, and virgins were considered sickly because their wombs lacked satisfaction. Marriage was presented as both a moral and medical necessity. Suspicion of celibacy. Nuns were often accused of hysteria, fainting fits, or visions. Rather than seeing these as spiritual experiences, critics interpreted them as symptoms of a wandering womb. Control of women's bodies. By framing sexual activity as necessary, medicine, male authority, extended into the most private aspects of women's lives. This created a paradox. Women were told that pleasure was sinful, yet sexual intercourse was prescribed as healing. The contradiction ensured that women remained trapped between guilt and dependence. Case study hysteria in medieval records. Historians studying medieval chronicles have found descriptions of women collapsing in marketplaces, churches, or homes. These incidents were almost always attributed to the womb. In one English parish record, a woman who fainted during Mass was said to suffer from the womb's suffocation. The priest performed prayers while neighbours brought pungent herbs. The community interpreted her recovery as proof that both medical and spiritual treatments worked together. Such examples show how deeply the wandering womb was embedded in daily life. Ordinary villagers, not just physicians, accepted the theory. It offered simple explanations for complex conditions. Epilepsy, anxiety, grief, even malnutrition could all be reduced to the womb's wanderings. Comparison to witchcraft accusations. The wandering womb also intersected with fears of witchcraft. Women who displayed uncontrollable movements, seizures, or trances were sometimes accused of being witches. But in less extreme cases, the same symptoms were labelled medical explained by the womb. This inconsistency reveals how society interpreted women's suffering through whatever lens reinforced male authority. If the church needed an enemy, the woman was a witch. If physicians wanted a patient, she had a wandering womb. Either way, her body was never her own. Language and power. Perhaps the most insidious legacy of the wandering womb was its control over language. By redefining women's experiences as symptoms of a restless organ, the theory robbed women of the ability to name their own sensations. Pleasure became purification, pain became proof of possession, and silence became survival. Women could not speak of their bodies without echoing the terms imposed by priests and physicians. Legacy beyond the Middle Ages. Though modern medicine eventually rejected the idea of a physically wandering womb, the echoes lasted for centuries. The term hysteria derived from the Greek word hystera womb, persisted into the 19th century. Women were still diagnosed with hysteria for symptoms ranging from nervousness to sexual desire. Treatments, massage, rest cures, even forced institutionalization reflected the same logic. Women's bodies were unstable, their needs suspect, and their voices untrustworthy. The wandering womb thus illustrates how ancient error filtered through medieval faith, shaped centuries of misunderstanding. It also shows how easily pseudoscience can reinforce social hierarchies, turning natural experiences into instruments of control. The trochlea and the shaping of women's medicine. One of the most significant medical collections of the Middle Ages was the trochlea produced in Salerno in the 12th century. Although partly attributed to the female physician Trota of Salerno, later scribes modified and republished, the text often minimizing its acknowledgement of female pleasure or autonomy. Within the trochlea were entire sections dedicated to suffocation of the womb. The remedies combined practical treatments like herbal infusions, warm compresses, and abdominal massage, with ideas inherited from antiquity such as fumigation and intercourse as cure. For instance, the text recommends placing sweet-smelling substances near the vagina to draw the womb downward, while placing foul odours near the nose to repel it upward. This bizarre push and pull logic illustrates the belief that the womb could literally be enticed by smell. The fact that such treatments persisted shows how deeply symbolic the womb was. It was imagined as not just an organ, but a creature with desires of its own. By presenting these treatments as authoritative medicine, the trochlea reinforced the idea that women required constant management by male experts. Nuns' visions and the wandering womb. The theory of the wandering womb also shaped interpretations of women in convents. Medieval records describe nuns experiencing fainting spells, trances, or ecstatic visions during prayer. While some of these experiences were celebrated as mystical encounters with God, critics often reinterpreted them through medical suspicion. Skeptical clerics suggested that these women were not touched by divinity, but plagued by their wombs. Celibacy, it was argued, left the womb unsatisfied, causing hysteria disguised as piety. Consider the case of Christina of Markiate, a 12th century English anchoress. Though remembered as a holy woman, some contemporaries speculated that her trances were not visions at all, but physical disturbances linked to her unmarried body. Similarly, Hildegard of Bingen's ecstatic visions were sometimes explained away by detractors as symptoms of a restless womb. These interpretations reveal the double-bind women faced even when their spirituality was genuine. Their bodies could be used to discredit them. Marriage and domestic life. The wandering womb also reinforced the institution of marriage. Medical authorities claimed that widows or spinsters were more prone to illness, while married women were healthier because regular intercourse anchored the womb. This belief translated into social pressure. A widow who resisted remarriage risked being seen as both morally suspect and physically fragile. Families used the rhetoric of health to justify pushing women into marriages that secured alliances or property. One illustrative case comes from a 13th century English legal record, in which a widow named Alice refused to remarry after her husband's death. Neighbours accused her of falling fits and attributed them to uterine suffocation. Though modern scholars suspect epilepsy, the community interpreted her condition as proof that she needed a husband. Her eventual forced marriage demonstrates how medical ideas could become instruments of coercion, broader cultural expressions. The wandering womb was not confined to medical treatises. It seeped into culture. In literature, female characters prone to fainting were often described as victims of uterine disorder. In art, allegories of women's instability were symbolized by serpents or animals curled within their bodies. These images reinforced the idea that women were ruled by something hidden and uncontrollable. Even in popular sayings, the womb became shorthand for irrationality. The stereotype of the weaker sex was less about muscle and more about supposed biological instability, comparing East and West. Interestingly, the theory of the wandering womb was not limited to Europe. In medieval Arabic medical texts, many of which influenced European scholars, similar ideas appear. The great physician Avicenna, for instance, wrote about suffocation of the womb and recommended treatments involving fumigation and massage. These cross-cultural parallels show how widely accepted the idea was and how it transcended religious boundaries. Yet in Christian Europe, the Church's overlay of sin and salvation gave the wandering womb a moral dimension absent elsewhere. In Islamic medicine, the womb was unruly but not demonic. In Christian Europe, it was both. The persistence of hysteria. Even after the Middle Ages, the wandering womb left a legacy. By the Renaissance, physicians began to reject the literal idea that the womb could move, yet they retained the connection between women's health and their reproductive organs. The very term hysteria, from hystera, Greek for womb, persisted into modern times. Women with anxiety, depression, or seizures were diagnosed with hysteria well into the 19th century. Treatments ranged from enforced rest to forced sexual stimulation by physicians' practices, disturbingly reminiscent of medieval cures. This continuity shows how slow science was to abandon cultural prejudice. Illustrative example, a village case. To bring this into focus, imagine a medieval village scene. A young, unmarried woman collapses in the marketplace, gasping for breath. Villagers rush to her aid, concluding her womb has risen toward her chest. A midwife is summoned who burns mugwort beneath her chair while the local priest sprinkles holy water. The woman trembles perhaps from fear or smoke inhalation and eventually regains her breath. The community declares the treatment successful. Her collapse is not seen as stress, hunger, or illness, but as proof of her womb's disobedience. And because she is unmarried, gossip grows. Perhaps her womb seeks what she has denied it. The incident pressures her family to arrange a marriage. Here we see the full cycle belief, ritual interpretation, and social consequence all driven by the wandering womb. Consequences for women's voices. The greatest impact of the wandering womb theory was not physical but psychological. By attributing women's distress to their reproductive organs, society silenced other explanations. A grieving widow could not say she was depressed. She was told her womb was restless. A nun who collapsed during fasting could not say she was starving. She was told her womb was suffocating her. In this way, women lost language to describe their own lives. Their suffering was real, but its meaning was always supplied by others, physicians, priests, husbands. The wandering womb became a metaphor for stolen agency. The theory of the wandering womb reveals how ancient misconceptions filtered through medieval faith and patriarchal structures shaped centuries of misunderstanding. By treating the womb as a restless animal, physicians justified intrusive treatments. By linking celibacy with illness, the Church reinforced marriage as obligation. By renaming women's experiences as symptoms, society silenced them. The womb, imagined as wandering, became a tool of control. Its legacy persisted long after the Middle Ages, reminding us that medical error is never just about science, it is about power, language, and the ability to define reality. Superstitious remedies in medieval medicine. If the wandering womb explained why women grew sick, the next question was how to make them well. The Middle Ages produced a dizzying variety of treatments, rituals of smoke and steam fumigation, with herbs, massages, prayers, exorcisms, and even prescribed intercourse. To modern readers, these remedies often appear bizarre, sometimes cruel, and almost always based on superstition rather than science. Yet to medieval men and women, they were part of an ordered worldview in which body, soul, and spirit could not be separated. Illness was not just physical, but moral, and healing had to be both medical and spiritual. This worldview gave rise to treatments that blurred the line between doctor and priest, between medicine and magic. To understand how orgasm came to be seen as a cure, we must explore these superstitious remedies, their methods, their symbolism, and the social realities they reinforced. The logic of superstition. At the heart of medieval healing was the belief that invisible forces governed health. Humors, spirits, and demons were woven into one system. If a woman collapsed, she might be suffering from an imbalance of fluids, the suffocation of her womb, or the attack of an evil spirit. In practice, these explanations overlapped and treatments combined physical manipulation with ritual action. Herbs and prayers were applied side by side because both were thought necessary to restore harmony. This blending of natural and supernatural made superstition inevitable. Every treatment carried symbolic meaning. Burning herbs did not just produce fumes, it drove out invisible corruption. Pouring holy water did not just cleanse the skin, it purified the soul. When a woman trembled or sighed during treatment, the community saw visible proof that evil was leaving her body. Relief was interpreted as victory, not for the woman, but for the authority of the ritual. Common remedies. Fumigation and aromatherapy. Perhaps the most famous remedy was fumigation. Physicians recommended placing sweet-smelling herbs near the vagina and foul odours near the nose, believing the womb could be lured back to its proper place. Common herbs included mugwort, sage rue, and rosemary. Sometimes dried animal dung or burnt hair was used as the repelling odour. The symbolism was clear: the womb was an animal that could be coaxed by scent. Example: a 13th century medical manual from Montpellier instructs physicians to burn myrrh and cinnamon under a woman's skirts while holding a piece of rancid meat to her nose. The womb, like a hound, would be drawn toward the fragrance and repelled from the stench. Steam baths and sweating cures. Women were often wrapped in heavy blankets and placed over steaming cauldrons of herbs. The goal was to sweat out impurities and force the womb downward. The steam itself may have provided temporary relief, but prolonged exposure caused fainting, which was interpreted as healing. Example records from Paris describe women being subjected to 3-day steam cures, after which attendants declared them purified even if they emerged weak and dehydrated. Massage and manual manipulation. Midwives massaged the abdomen with oils to guide the womb. While this may have provided comfort, it was often paired with invasive examinations by male physicians who claimed authority to explore and adjust the uterus. The practice blurred into exploitation protected by medical rhetoric. Prescribed intercourse. Perhaps the most socially charged remedy was intercourse itself. Texts like the Trotula suggested that orgasm could release pent-up humours and restore balance. Husbands were advised to fulfill their wives' needs, not for pleasure, but for health. In this way, marital sex was sanctified as medicine binding women's well-being to male authority. Exorcism and prayer. When physical remedies failed, spiritual ones took precedence. Priests recited exorcisms, laid relics on the body, and sprinkled holy water. The line between healing and sacrament disappeared. For the community, the ritual reaffirmed that illness was spiritual warfare. Symbolism of remedies. The remedies themselves reveal how medieval society imagined women's bodies unstable and animal-like, lured by scent, tamed by ritual, polluted and in need of cleansing, steamed, purged, or exorcised, passive and dependent, requiring constant male intervention. Even when remedies brought comfort, the interpretation always diminished women's agency. A woman who sighed in relief was not credited with resilience. Her reaction was proof that the ritual worked. Her body became an instrument of validation for clerical and medical authority. Case studies. Case 1. The Nun of Brescia. A 14th century chronicle tells of a nun who suffered convulsions during prayer. Physicians declared her womb had risen toward her chest. She was subjected to fumigation with herbs, while priests chanted psalms. When she collapsed from exhaustion, they proclaimed her healed. The episode reinforced the authority of both medicine and religion, while the nun's voice was lost. Case 2. A peasant wife in England. Parish records from 13th century England describe a farmer's wife who fainted repeatedly. Neighbours burned mugwort under her chair and placed burning feathers under her nose. When she awoke coughing, they declared her womb had returned to its place. The cure became part of village memory, cited as proof of divine and natural order. Case 3. Midwives on trial. Several midwives in the Rhineland were accused of witchcraft for using herbal fumigation. Their chants and rituals were reinterpreted as diabolical, even though physicians used similar methods. The difference was authority. When men performed the ritual, it was medicine. When women did, it was superstition. Social effects of remedies. These remedies did more than treat illness. They reinforced social hierarchies. Priests over parishioners, exorcisms, proved the church's spiritual power. Husbands over wives, intercourse as cure, made female health dependent on male bodies. Physicians over midwives, written medicine, legitimized men, while oral tradition criminalized women. Thus, superstition was not simply error, it was a system of control. By defining treatment in symbolic ways, medieval society kept women's experiences under male interpretation. Continuities into later history. The legacy of these remedies persisted into early modern Europe. Steam baths and fumigation remained common, while hysteria continued to be linked to the womb. In the 19th century, physicians still prescribed pelvic massage as treatment for nervous disorders, a chilling echo of medieval remedies. What began as superstition became institutionalized as medicine. Superstitious remedies in the Middle Ages were not random oddities, but deeply structured practices. They combined medical, spiritual, and social meanings in ways that reinforced male authority and silenced women. From fumigation to exorcism, every treatment turned women's bodies into stages for performance of healing, of power, of fear. These practices remind us that medicine is never just about bodies. It is also about who has the right to define truth. Remedies as public rituals. Superstitious remedies were rarely private acts. They often unfolded before a community. The spectacle of treatment reinforced shared belief. When a woman fainted, neighbours crowded around bringing herbs, relics, or charms. If she trembled during fumigation, witnesses interpreted the movement as evidence that evil was leaving her body. The ritual was therefore not only about the patient, but also about the audience. Healing was proof that the community's worldview remained intact. In many villages, the churchyard or parish hall doubled as a place for cures. A sick woman might be laid on the steps of the church, where priests performed exorcisms while townspeople watched. The very visibility of the act was part of the remedy. By witnessing suffering and relief, communities reassured themselves that order, faith, and hierarchy were preserved. Blending of magic and medicine. The Middle Ages did not clearly separate magic from medicine. Spells, prayers, and recipes overlapped freely. A fumigation ritual might include not only herbs, but also incantations words meant to guide the womb. Some practitioners traced circles in the air, inscribed crosses on the belly, or murmured charms while massaging. To later, clerical authorities, such practices looked suspiciously like witchcraft. Yet in everyday practice, they were seen as extensions of medicine. One 12th century medical text from Salerno described a recipe for uterine suffocation, burn, rosemary, and storax resin. Then recite the Lord's Prayer 3 times as the smoke rises. Here, Christian ritual and herbalism fused seamlessly. The smoke targeted the body, while the prayer targeted the soul. Both were necessary for the cure. The role of exorcism. Exorcism deserves special attention as one of the most common superstitious remedies. When a woman exhibited uncontrolled movements, shaking, writhing, or screaming, priests interpreted it as possession. Exorcisms combined dramatic gestures, holy water, crucifixes, relics with hours of chanting. The afflicted woman often collapsed in exhaustion, which was taken as proof of the demon's expulsion. Example: in 1322 chronicles from Cologne describe a young woman who shrieked during Mass. The priest placed relics of saints on her chest, while villagers pressed her limbs down. After several hours, she fell unconscious. The record notes that when she awoke quietly, the demon had departed. To modernize, this looks like trauma or seizure. To medieval witnesses, it was successful medicine. Gendered dimensions of remedies. These superstitious remedies disproportionately targeted women. Men also received cures, but their illnesses were more often attributed to humoral imbalance or external causes. Women, by contrast, were seen as porous, spiritually vulnerable, and ruled by reproductive organs. Remedies thus centered on their sexuality and fertility. Fumigation and massages emphasized their wombs. Prescribed intercourse reinforced marriage. Exorcisms dramatized their supposed susceptibility to demons. Even when remedies provided real comfort, warm compresses, calming rituals, or social attention, the interpretation stripped women of agency. Relief was never their accomplishment. It was credited to priests, husbands, or doctors. The economy of remedies. Cures were not only spiritual, but also economic. Physicians charged fees for fumigation herbs and examinations. Priests received donations for exorcisms and blessings. Families invested in remedies not simply for health, but for social reputation. To be seen caring for a sick woman showed moral responsibility. Failure to treat her with proper rituals could invite gossip or accusations of neglect. In this way, superstition became a market. For example, in Bologna, records from the 14th century, families paid notaries to document the purchase of herbs for uterine suffocation. These documents reveal that remedies were public acts of responsibility, proving that husbands and fathers had fulfilled their duty to control women's health. Example: the steam cure in detail. One of the most vivid remedies was the steam cure. Women were seated over steaming pots of aromatic plants, wrapped tightly in cloth, and left until sweat poured from their bodies. Attendants interpreted sweating as the expulsion of toxins, but the process was grueling. Prolonged exposure caused dizziness, fainting, and sometimes burns. In Paris, a wealthy widow named Isabel underwent repeated steam cures for uterine suffocation. Witnesses reported that she shook violently and fell unconscious. Physicians declared her cured, though her health remained fragile. What mattered was not her recovery, but the affirmation of the treatment's power. Steam cures reveal how suffering itself was framed as healing pain became proof of progress. Remedies and sexuality. Perhaps the most controversial element of superstitious remedies was the prescription of intercourse. The idea that orgasm could release blocked humours transformed the marital bed into a medical arena. Husbands were told they had a duty to ensure their wives' satisfaction, not for pleasure's sake, but for health. This blurred consent, turning intimacy into obligation. In some cases, physicians even recommended widows or celibate women remarry for their health. A 15th century German medical manual advised that a woman too long without the embrace of a man will suffer suffocation of the womb. Such prescriptions reinforced patriarchy, framing women's health as incomplete without male intervention. Long-term effects of superstitious remedies. Though modern readers dismiss these practices as absurd, they shaped centuries of culture. The remedies institutionalized ideas that women's bodies were unstable. Female relief was always mediated by male authority. Pain, suffering, and exhaustion were signs of cure. These notions persisted beyond the Middle Ages. The very word hysteria, rooted in the Greek word for womb hystera, carried forward the idea that women's health was tied to reproductive organs. In the 19th century, doctors still prescribed pelvic massage or even early vibrators as cures for hysteria, echoes of medieval remedies that conflated orgasm medicine and control. Superstitious remedies in the Middle Ages reveal a world where healing was as much about power as about health. Herbs, smoke, steam, and sex were not just treatments, but rituals that reaffirmed authority of priests over parishioners, husbands over wives, physicians over midwives. Relief was staged as spectacle, interpreted through the lens of sin and salvation. Women's bodies became the battleground where superstition, medicine, and faith collided. These practices remind us that error in medicine is never just scientific, it is cultural. Superstitious remedies were not accidents of ignorance, but deliberate systems that sustained hierarchy, silenced women, and transformed suffering into obedience. Natural reactions, hidden and rebranded. The wind rattled the shutters of a physician's chamber in Rouen. Inside, the air was heavy, with the smell of damp wood, ink, and dried herbs. A young woman, Madeleine, sat rigid on a stool, her eyes darting toward the door, as if escape might still be possible. She had been brought here by her brother, who whispered nervously about her fits moments when she trembled and sighed, as though seized by something beyond her will. The physician, Master Henri, adjusted his robe, dipped a quill in ink, and began to speak not to Madeleine, but to the apprentice standing at his side. "Observe," he said, in Latin, "the womb has risen, obstructing the breath. The cure requires fumigation and gentle correction." Madeleine did not understand the words. All she knew was the heat rising in her chest, the fear that churned in her belly. The apprentice lit a small brazier sprinkling herbs that filled the room with acrid smoke. Henry leaned forward, pressing his hands in practiced motions along her abdomen. Madeleine gasped her body, betraying her with a tremor that swept through her like a sudden storm. Tears welled in her eyes. A deep sigh escaped her lips. Henry did not see a young woman trembling with fear and relief. He saw a demonstration. He nodded with satisfaction and dictated to his apprentice, expulsio vaporis. Obedientia achieved. And just like that, Madeleine's experience ceased to be hers. It was rewritten in Latin, filed away as medical truth, a specimen for future students. Across medieval Europe, this scene played out countless times. Women's bodies, with their natural rhythms of tension and release, were taken from them in language. Trembling, sighing, warmth, tears, these were all reactions the body knew instinctively. But in the mouths of physicians and priests they became something else. Purification, expulsion, obedience, correction. It was not denial exactly, it was renaming. And renaming was just as powerful for it, silenced women, not by forbidding their voices, but by giving them words that were not their own. The vocabulary of disguise. To survive in medieval society was to navigate a dictionary written by others. A woman who shuddered during fumigation was said to have been purified. A wife who sighed after a night of intimacy was said to have been corrected. A nun who collapsed in relief after herbs and prayers was said to have shown obedience. A girl who wept during a ritual was praised for her silence. The terms sounded benign, even virtuous, but they erased the possibility that what these women felt was human, physical, sometimes even pleasurable. Instead, their bodies became symbols of doctrine and data points for science. Vignette, the market gossip. In the marketplace of Dijon, women traded more than vegetables. They traded stories. One spoke of her cousin, who had suffered suffocation of the womb. Another nodded knowingly and said, but she was purified by the priest. A third added, yes, the demon left her body at last. But if you had asked the cousin herself quietly away from the crowd, she might have said something very different. They placed a warm cloth upon me. I trembled, I sighed, and then I could finally breathe. Her account did not survive. The market remembered the priest's words, not hers. Community memory preserved only the official version: purification, deliverance, obedience. Hidden ledgers. Some women fought to preserve the truth. A midwife, in Regensburg Dorothea, kept 2 ledgers. The first was for priests and husbands. It listed herbs, compresses prayers, and always concluded with patient purified. The second ledger was hidden under her bed. In it she wrote the words her patients whispered when no one else could hear. It felt like a flood. The knot inside me loosened. I was afraid, and then I was free. These secret notes never reached the archives. They were never cited in sermons or copied into medical treatises, but they remind us that women were not silent, they were silenced. The physics of euphemism. Euphemism worked like friction. It generated heat but slowed motion. Rituals often did soothe herbs, calmed nerves, warmth relaxed, muscles prayers provided comfort. But recognition was delayed, distorted. Gratitude fused with shame. I am purified, therefore I was unclean. I am obedient, therefore I was rebellious. The relief itself became accusation. Women learned to doubt their own sensations, to suspect that peace could only mean prior sin. The winter wind howled against the walls of a convent near Ghent. Inside, the infirmary glowed with lamplight. Sister Clara, still in her novice's veil, lay curled on a narrow cot. Her chest rose and fell in uneven waves, each breath caught by a knot of fear. Sister Agnes, the infirmarian, set a clay bowl of steaming herbs on the floor. The air filled with lavender and mugwort. She hummed a psalm, though not loudly enough to drown the sound of Clara's trembling. Gently she placed her hands on the girl's abdomen, pressing in rhythm with her breathing. Clara gasped. Her whole body shook, then stilled. She wept openly, clutching Agnes's sleeve. For the first time in weeks, she fell into deep sleep. The abbess, arriving later, wrote in the convent register, Sister Clara, purified by holy herbs and prayer. The language was safe, pious, and acceptable to visiting confessors. Yet it was also a theft. Clara had not said she felt purified. She had said nothing at all. Her body had spoken in sighs and tears, but those words did not survive. The household script. Beyond convent walls, similar scenes unfolded in peasant cottages and noble halls. Husbands learned the same vocabulary from priests and physicians. A wife's tremor at night was not desire fulfilled, nor relief. Sought it was evidence that she had been corrected. In York, a peasant named Joan collapsed from exhaustion after harvest. Her husband, ashamed of neighbours' whispers, insisted she was restored after he had fulfilled his marital duty. Joan, too tired to argue, nodded. To resist the script was to risk scandal. In London, a merchant's wife sighed after fumigation. Her husband boasted at the tavern. She expelled the ill humours at last. Thanks be to God. His friends congratulated him, not her. The story belonged to him now. Vignette: the side chapel at Rouen. In a side chapel near Rouen, villagers gathered for an exorcism. A young woman named Isabel was brought in by her family, her body shaking with fits. The priest ordered rosemary burned beneath her stool, chanting Latin as smoke rose. Isabel, convulsed, cried out, then collapsed in stillness. The priest lifted his cross. The demon has fled. The crowd erupted in relief. Isabel's mother wept, convinced her daughter had been saved. Later that night, Isabel whispered to her sister, "I felt heat flood through me." Then everything loosened and I could breathe. Her sister held her hand but said nothing. To repeat those words aloud would be dangerous. By morning, the market repeated only the priest's version. Isabel herself had disappeared from her own story. Why women borrowed the words? It would be easy to ask why women did not speak more boldly, but to survive they often had no choice. Borrowing official language was a passport. Say purified, and you received prayers and broth. Say pleasured, and you risked accusation. Even silence was interpreted. Exhaustion became virtue, collapse became obedience. In such a world, honesty was peril. Self-preservation demanded translation. Yet this translation took its toll. Over time, women began to doubt their own sensations. Relief no longer felt wholly theirs. It arrived stamped with the church's seal, the physician's authority, the husband's pride, community memory as a cage. Memory itself was reshaped by euphemism. A grandmother would tell her granddaughter, Sister Agnes, was purified in that chapel. So shall you be. The founding scene, the trembling, the sighs, the tears was gone. Only the purified version remained. Each retelling narrowed the path. The next woman entered not as herself, but as a role already scripted. Her experience was expected to match the memory. If it did not, the community corrected her until it did. The scriptural veil. The Bible offered endless metaphors for cleansing and expulsion. Tears echoed David's psalms. Tremors resembled demons convulsing before banishment. Rest recalled the Lord's pastures. These scriptures comforted. They also covered. A woman could speak safely only inside them. I was cleansed. I was delivered. I was obedient. The simple word pleasure had no psalm to shield it. Vignette: the noblewoman's letter. In Provence, a noblewoman wrote to her friend. After visiting a physician, he found the knot and loosened it. I burned like fire and then fell like ashes. Her lady-in-waiting, alarmed, begged her to strike the line before sealing the letter. The woman hesitated, then crossed it out. What remained was safe. I am restored by the physician's care. Her truth was erased by her own hand for survival. Quiet resistance. Still resistance flickered in hidden corners. A nun in Burgundy changed the infirmary log from obedient to rested. A young priest in Saxony wrote simply peace instead of purified. A mother taught her daughter to use heat and breath without attaching any moral label, tiny gestures, but together they kept the door ajar. They proved that even in a world drowning in borrowed words, some women and men remembered the difference between language and life. The bells of Cologne tolled midnight as Hild, a miller's wife, sat alone beside the hearth. Her body still quivered from the ritual she had endured earlier that day. The priest had pressed relics to her chest while her neighbours crowded close whispering prayers. When she gasped and slumped forward, they proclaimed her purified. But Hilda knew no demon had fled. What left her was not a spirit, but tension that had knotted her chest for weeks. She had no words safe enough to name it. To say I was purified would protect her. To say I felt relief would invite suspicion. She chose silence, which everyone else translated for her. The cost of translation. This was the hidden price of euphemism truth, died in the act of survival. Each woman who borrowed the official vocabulary preserved her safety but surrendered her experience. And the more often it happened, the more alien her own sensations became. Relief began to feel less like her body's wisdom and more like the church's blessing. Desire began to feel less like a human hunger and more like sin in need of correction. Language itself became a cage, invisible but inescapable. Vignette: The Weaver's Dream. A weaver's daughter in Flanders dreamt she was drowning in a river. In her dream she gasped, cried, and then floated in calm. Upon waking after a fumigation ritual, she whispered to her mother, "It felt just like my dream water rising, then peace." Her mother hushed her. "Say only that you were cleansed." The daughter obeyed. The dream was forgotten. The word cleansed lived on. Records that outlived reality. The survival of documents ensured the triumph of euphemism. Priests' registers, physicians, notebooks, abbesses, ledgers, all repeated the same terms: purified, corrected, obedient. Future generations looking back saw only these words. The sensations themselves were buried beneath them. When historians today comb medieval archives, they find endless mentions of demons expelled and wombs corrected. Rarely do they find the raw honesty of women's own voices. And yet, in the occasional letter margin note or hidden ledger, we glimpse the ghost of truth, the body speaking before it was silenced. Community as enforcer. It was not only priests and physicians who enforced euphemism. Neighbours, husbands, even mothers became its guardians. A girl who spoke too freely was corrected by her elders. A wife who hinted at desire was warned by her peers. Everyone knew the words that were safe, and everyone policed them. Thus the cage of language was built not just from above, but from all sides. Women carried it within themselves, repeating words they did not believe, because to do otherwise was unthinkable. Small fires of defiance. And yet human truth cannot be erased entirely. We find it flickering in secret acts. A nun who whispered to her closest friend, "It felt like warmth flooding me." A midwife who passed down a recipe with a wink, saying, "This brings calm, though I cannot tell you why." A husband who quietly ashamed admitted, "She sighed, and I do not think it was because of me, but because she needed it." These fragments did not overturn the system, but they kept memory alive. They prove that even in the darkest silence, people found ways to tell the truth, if only in whispers. A closing scene. Picture one final moment. A woman sits in a dimly lit chamber, a warm cloth pressed against her belly. She trembles, sighs, and at last her breathing deepens. She feels a wave of peace she cannot name aloud. The physician writes in Latin purified. The priest declares, delivered. The neighbours repeat, obedient. But inside her chest, where no one else can hear, she whispers to herself, alive. That whisper is the thread that connects us to her across centuries. It may not appear in the records, but it survives in the imagination, reminding us that no euphemism can erase the body's truth completely. Bridge to the next chapter. This chapter has traced how women's natural reactions were hidden and rebranded by the languages of medicine, religion, and community. Tremors became expulsion, sighs became obedience, relief became purification. It was a theft disguised as protection, but language did not exist in isolation. The words built rooms, convents, infirmaries, physicians' chambers, marriage beds, where those renamed reactions became institutional practices. In the next chapter, we step into the convents and midwives' cottages, where care and control entwined in the most intimate ways. The bells of Florence's cathedral rang across the city, summoning worshippers to prayer. Among the crowd was Lucia, a laundress whose hands were raw from scrubbing. She had suffered for weeks from sudden spells of weakness, moments when her body trembled, and she felt strangely lighter afterward. Her neighbours whispered that she was afflicted with mal d'amore, an ailment they believed only priests could cure. Lucia was taken into a side chapel where incense was burned beneath her stool. The priest, sweating under his heavy vestments, declared loudly, "She has been cleansed by holy smoke." The congregation nodded in relief, repeating the word cleansed until it became the only memory of the event. Lucia herself never spoke of what she had felt. In the official record, she was simply purified. The parish ledger. In a small English village near Norwich, Father Edmund kept a meticulous parish ledger. On one page, he listed a dozen women treated in a single year. Martha corrected by fumigation. Alice purified by prayer. Joan obedient after holy oil. The ledger gave the impression of a community delivered from affliction. Yet, behind each entry was a silenced woman whose body had spoken in sighs, moans, or tears. No one asked Martha what correction felt like. No one recorded Alice's relief in her own words. The ledger became the truth overwriting lived experience with official language. Family pressure. In Burgundy, a farmer's wife named Margot returned from a ritual pale and shaken. She whispered to her sister. It was heat and trembling, nothing more. But her husband interrupted, repeating loudly to the neighbours. She was purified at last, praise God. Margot's own words dissolved under her husband's authority. From that day forward, the family repeated only his version. Within weeks, even Margot began to doubt herself, wondering if perhaps purification really was the right word, the price of survival. Why did women allow such renaming? Because the alternative was dangerous. To admit to physical release or pleasure was to risk accusations of lust, witchcraft, or demonic possession. Safer to repeat the official script, I was cleansed, I was obedient. This choice preserved social standing but chipped away at identity. Each borrowed word distanced women from their own sensations. Over time, they began to internalize the vocabulary. The body's truth became indistinguishable from the church's doctrine. A Tuscan comparison. Not every region used the same metaphors. In Tuscany, physicians preferred liberata, liberated. In Paris, the common term was purifier. In English villages, it was cleansed or restored. The language shifted, but the effect was constant. Women's experiences were translated into safe terms that erased their agency. These subtle regional differences remind us how flexible euphemism can be. Like smoke, it fills every chamber, taking the shape of whatever container it finds. Vignette the silent nun. At a convent in Milan, Sister Beatrice endured recurring episodes of trembling and collapse. After one such event, the abbess wrote in the register, Sister Beatrice obedient after the ritual. Years later, when the register was read aloud to visitors, Beatrice sat silently, hands folded as though she agreed. But in her private diary, found centuries later, she wrote a different truth. I felt fear, then warmth, then stillness. They call it obedience. I call it rest. Her diary was an exception. Most such voices never survived. But it reveals how women consciously lived under two vocabularies, the public safe one and the private honest one. The generational echo. Mothers taught daughters to repeat the safe words. A child who trembled after a herbal compress was told, "Say you were purified, little one. That way no one will question you." Over time, entire generations learned to mistrust their sensations, filtering them through a language of obedience. This generational echo hardened into tradition. By the late Middle Ages, to describe oneself as purified or cleansed felt natural, even automatic. What began as survival had become habit. The lost archive of the body. The tragedy of this euphemistic system is not only what it did to individuals, but what it did to history. The true archive, the archive of the body, was erased. What survives are only the official words, sterile and uniform. Imagine how different our understanding would be if women's own voices had been preserved. I sighed with relief. I trembled in fear. I felt warmth flood me. Instead, we inherit ledgers and treatises that tell us only of purification and obedience. The renaming of natural reactions was a theft repeated in every chamber, every parish, every family. It silenced women not by gagging them, but by handing them words that erased their truth. And yet within the cracks of this system, fragments survived a hidden diary, a whispered confession, a mother's quiet lesson. These fragments are enough to remind us that beneath the official language lay a vast sea of human experience, still waiting to be heard. As we move forward, we leave behind the euphemisms of purification and correction and step into the places where these rituals were most often performed, convents, infirmaries and cottages where care and control were always entangled. Convents, midwives, and the blend of care and control. The convent bells of Chartres echoed across the countryside at dawn. Inside the infirmary, the air was heavy with incense and herbs mingling the sacred and the practical. Sister Agnes bent over a wooden cot where a young novice Marianne lay trembling. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on her brow. Her lips parted in restless sighs. Agnes whispered a prayer, but her hands moved with the precision of generations of women before her. She brewed a tisane of sage, and mugwort pressed a warm cloth to Marianne's belly and guided her breath in slow rhythm. Soon the girl's gasps softened into steady sighs, her shoulders relaxing at last. The abbess entering later made the sign of the cross and wrote in the register, Sister Marianne, obedient after the ritual. To the abbess, it was obedience. To Agnes, it was healing. To Marianne, it was relief. Yet only one version survived in the official record. Between care and surveillance. This was the paradox of convent life. Nuns often cared for each other with extraordinary tenderness. Their knowledge of herbs, massage, and simple rituals was passed down through centuries of female wisdom. Yet their acts of care were always framed within the language of obedience. If a novice sighed with relief, the abbess declared her soul cleansed. If a sister collapsed in exhaustion, the confessor praised her humility. In this way, the line between healing and discipline blurred. What the body experienced as peace was recorded as virtue. Vignette: the midwife's visit. Beyond convent walls, midwives carried similar wisdom into peasant cottages. In a thatched hut outside Rouen, a midwife named Isabel arrived with her satchel of herbs. A farmer's wife, Anne, had suffered restless nights and fainting fits. Isabel boiled pennyroyal and fennel, applying the steam beneath Anne's skirts. The woman trembled, then slumped in stillness, whispering, "I can breathe again." But when the parish priest inquired later, Anne's husband answered, "The midwife purified her." The word travelled through the village until it hardened into truth. Anne's own whisper vanished, replaced by the safer vocabulary of cleansing. Midwives under suspicion. Midwives lived in constant tension. They were trusted for their remedies, yet watched carefully by priests and magistrates. Too much success could bring accusations of witchcraft. Too little success invited ridicule. Their survival depended on speaking the language of purification and obedience, even as they quietly preserved women's unspoken truths. One midwife in Flanders confessed under interrogation that she had kept 2 sets of notes. In one she wrote of expelled demons and purified wombs. In the other, hidden beneath her mattress, she recorded what women actually said. It was warmth, it was release, it was peace. When the authorities found both ledgers, the first was preserved in the archives. The second was burned. Care entangled with authority. Even when care was genuine, it was rarely free of authority. In convents, abbesses reported to confessors. In villages, midwives answered to priests. Every act of female care was overshadowed by male oversight. Thus, a woman's sigh of relief was never just hers. It was observed, named, and filed away as evidence of obedience. Healing could not exist without surveillance. Vignette: the silent circle. In a convent near Bologna, a group of sisters gathered in secret. One of them, Sister Lucia, had been plagued by fits. Instead of calling the abbess, they gathered in the laundry away from watchful eyes. They brewed herbs, held her hands and sang softly until her tremors eased. Afterward, they swore silence. To admit what they had done would invite suspicion of impropriety. Their act of compassion became a secret rebellion hidden beneath the habits of obedience. Regional contrasts. In Italy, convents were often centres of medical knowledge, where nuns studied texts and practised surgery. In England, midwives wielded more independence, but faced harsher suspicion. In France, parish priests kept stricter oversight, weaving rituals tightly into confession. Yet, across regions, the pattern was the same: women cared for each other, but their care was interpreted through the lens of obedience and purification. Their voices remained secondary to the language of the institution. The river beside the convent at Chartres overflowed its banks in early spring, turning fields into mirrors of sky. Within the walls, the infirmary smelled of warmed linen and thyme. Sister Agnes' sleeves rolled to her elbows, wrung out a cloth, and laid it across Marianne's abdomen. The girl's eyes fluttered, then steadied. Agnes counted her breaths with quiet murmurs, letting each number be a small stepping stone across fear. Later, when the bell called the community to prime, the abbess came to the infirmary door. She took in the scene with a measured glance, the basin, the herbs, the novice, drowsy with relief. Her quill scratched a line in the register. Sister Marianne, obedient after the ritual. She did not lie, not in the way the world counted lies. She only chose the word the world would accept. Agnes washed her hands in the cooling water and looked at the novice sleeping soundly. Obedient, she whispered, tasting the word, the way one tastes a foreign spice. Rested, she corrected, except no one would read her correction. The visitor from the city. That same week, a matron from the cathedral town asked to see the infirmary. Dame Isabeau, draped in wool, the colour of storm clouds, arrived with a satchel of donations and a bundle of questions. She admired the rows of jars, valerian chamomile, rosemary, and paused at a handwritten leaflet pinned beside the shelves. Breathing counts, steeping times the order in which compresses should be applied. Who wrote this? She asked. The late Sister Alex Agnes replied. She served in the infirmary for 30 years. A shame it is not in Latin, dame, Isabeau said, not unkindly. It might have outlived her better that way. Agnes folded the cloth once more, her face calm. It outlives her each time it helps a sister breathe. The matron's lips curved into a concession of a smile. Still, when she spoke to the abbess, her praise ran through familiar channels, the community's obedience, the discipline of the rule, the piety that made good order possible. She carried those words back into town, where they would do no harm and no great good either. The story of breath returning, of panic easing under a warm palm, remained locked in a room with no Latin door, the laundry, the song, and the secret. Work did not stop for illness in the convent. The sisters sang as they scrubbed linens in the laundry voices, weaving the plainchant into ordinary time. On a grey afternoon, Sister Lucia paused mid-verse, her hands submerged in lye-scented water. A spiral of tension gripped her belly. She leaned into the table, breath snagging high in her chest. Sister Agnes noticed without fuss. She did not call for the abbess or the confessor. She guided Lucia to a bench, by the window opened the shutters for air, wrapped a linen around a heated brick, and placed it carefully across the novice's lower belly. With the rhythm of singing as metronome, she pressed in time with Lucia's breath. The others kept the chant-going notes, shaped like a bridge over the moment. Lucia shook, then softened. She laughed once, a little shocked by ease. Agnes nodded, eyes bright. When the abbess later asked why a psalm had faltered that hour, the choir mistress answered a draft, and the story ended there. Care had happened in the seam of a song hidden from the ledger that would have renamed it. A midwife's road. Beyond the walls, a midwife walked a road that braided river light and shadow. Isabel of Rouen, known for arriving with a satchel full of leaves and a mouthful of cautions. She corrected no one's confessions. She wrote nothing the priest could seize. Her ledger was the memory of her hands. She entered a low cottage where a woman named Anne sat with her back against the bedframe, fists pressing into her hips. The room held the faint animal smell of fear. The husband stood useless near the door, muttering blessings like apologies. Isabel knelt, wrapped a towel around a steaming kettle, and let the breath of fennel and mint curl beneath Anne's skirt. Heat woke, the body's own knowing breath, deepened jaw, unclenched shoulders unwound. Anne's face changed the way a clenched fist becomes an open hand. Tears came not from pain, but from the sudden absence of it. "It's easing," Anne whispered. Isabel smiled and said nothing more. She had learned that naming the ease could put it on trial. When the priest asked the husband a week later how his wife fared, the man answered in words he'd heard in sermons. She was purified. The priest nodded, relieved to have a story with a familiar ending, the minute book and the bonfire. Not every midwife was so cautious. In Flanders, a woman named Lise kept 2-minute books, much as Dorothea in distant Regensburg had done. In one she wrote what authorities wanted, expelled vapour, purified, corrected. In the other, she wrote what women said when they were safe. It felt like release. I found my breath. I slept. A parish clerk, eager to please his new superior, discovered the second book under a stack of blankets. He read lines that did not fit the parish grammar and carried them to the priest like a fox with contraband. The priest hesitated, then chose public safety over private truth. The second book burned behind the sacristy. ashes ribboned up into a blue afternoon. Lise watched from the alley and memorized every line she could before the smoke erased them. For years afterward, she repeated the sentences to her apprentices, until memory became a living book that could not be seized. The Pilgrim and the Rope Bridge. On the road between Siena and Florence, pilgrims travelled in knots, men and women with scallop shells tied to their hats, seeking blessings, cures, or distraction from hunger. Among them walked a girl of 19, called Caterina by some, and Cata by those who loved her. She had suffered spells heat, trembling, a tidal release she could not predict, and had come to a hilltop hermitage rumoured to heal what doctors named and could not mend. The hermit, a woman who had once been a nun and had outlived the patience of any institution, offered Caterina bread and olives, then a square of cloth warmed on stones. "Breathe into your hips," she said softly. "Imagine the breath falling through you, like millet through a sieve." Caterina did as she was told. The gravel of her breath smoothed into a stream, her hands unclenched, then her thighs. The hermit kept her company until the girl laughed the bright laugh of a child who has found a lost path. "What do I owe you?" Caterina asked. "A truth," the hermit said, but she did not ask to hear it. She had watched enough women have their truths renamed to know that the safest listener was sometimes silence. At the next village, Caterina lit a candle in thanks and left the offering without explaining its story. The church ledger noted a donation for purification. Heaven mercifully does not keep the same books. The physician inside the convent. Not all control came from without. Sometimes it arrived wearing the same wool as the sisters. A physician with a license from Paris visited the convent at Tours under the abbess's invitation. He moved like a man sure of the grammar of things. He measured pulses, peered at tongues, and declared several sisters afflicted by suffocatio matriciis, the same diagnosis he might have given to a merchant's wife in the city. He ordered fumigations applied by a lay sister under his supervision and took careful notes in Latin. Obedientia post correctio, he wrote, after one trembling subsided. The abbess read the notation with satisfaction. It sounded tidy, doctrinally comfortable. Agnes, who had spent 30 years learning the small practical miracles of warmth and timing, felt a little of the room's oxygen pulled away. She continued her work patience first, philosophy second, but she copied the physician's phrasing into the official register because that was the price of keeping men with seals and rings from closing doors. When care refused to perform, a winter famine brought hunger to the countryside, and with hunger came the kind of trembling that herbs cannot touch. Women fainted not from fear or fits, but because they had left food for their children. The priest stood helpless before this physics. The physician's Latin thinned. Agnes made soups from bones and peels, hid loaves in laundry baskets for families, too proud to ask, and watched as women's spells receded before bread, in a way that no ritual could rival. No register recorded those cures. No sermon praised the sacrament of stew. But the women who ate remembered exactly what returned their breath. For a season, words like purification sounded tinny against the bell of a full belly. The body, when it is listened to, sits the loudest of witnesses. A nun's experiment with language. Sister Alady, who copied choir books with a hand steady as moonlight, tried a small experiment. She was tasked with updating the infirmary log when Agnes was called away to tend a dying lay sister. Alady wrote what she saw. Sister Claire trembled, then her breath slowed. She slept in peace. No purificata, no obedientia. When the confessor visited and skimmed the pages, he did not remark on the change. Weeks later, the abbess did. She tapped the line, with a neat fingernail. Peace is a beautiful word, the abbess said, not unkindly, but the bishop likes obedience. Do they differ? Alade asked, gentle as rain. In the ledger, the abbess replied, they do. After that, Alade wrote obedient for the bishop and peace inside the margins of her mind. In the scriptorium, where ink breathed slowly across vellum, she taught the younger scribes 2 handwritings, the public, one that pleased, and the private one that remembered, Midwives and the moving target. As universities grew, physicians appropriated what midwives had long practiced and wrapped it in a vocabulary that shut the door behind them. Isabel attended a city birth where a doctor insisted on leading. He ordered a fumigation she had already prepared and called the compress she'd suggested by a learned name she could not pronounce. Later, he wrote an account for his guild that transformed her into an assistant. Things must have names, he told her afterward, not unkindly. They do, she agreed. But sometimes the name comes after the saving, and then it should be given back to the one who saved. He did not understand. Institutions rarely do. They keep the nouns like keys. They forget the hands that turned the tumblers. A procession and a promise. On the feast of Corpus Christi, the town poured into the streets for a procession. Children scattered petals. Altar boys rang handbells in patterns that tripped like laughter. Women lined the way, some out of devotion, some to gossip more efficiently. Isabel walked among them, her satchel light, because it was a feast day, and no one was supposed to be sick on a feast day. She had made promises to herself long ago to speak the safe words outside and the true ones inside, to let the women own whatever could be kept, to refuse her knowledge to any man who demanded it like a tax. As the monstrance passed and sun struck it into a private star, she saw Anne the farmer's wife standing straighter than she had all winter. Their eyes met, neither spoke. There are words that fall like shutters, and words that open like windows. The 2 women chose the open ones, even in silence, quiet law and loud mercy. A magistrate's clerk posted a notice warning midwives not to perform superstitious rituals. It listed fumigation massages, the tying of charms, and any other acts whereby demons may be tempted to depart. A week later, a girl who had been fainting daily came to Isabel in a panic because her mother had read the notice and ripped the sprig of basil from above the hearth, Sit Isabel said. She made tea. She warmed a cloth. The girl's breath slowed, the rim of the world unclenched. No demon fled, no ritual dazzled. A human being became less frightened in the presence of another who refused to be afraid. The notice stayed nailed to the door of the hall, its ink untroubled by any of this. The ledger that learned a new word. Back in the convent, Agnes grew old, the way a tree does rings, added quietly beneath the bark. A young infirmarian took her place at the cotangent side more often. When Agnes could no longer lift a basin, she sat at a desk and totaled the herbs, wrote the supply lists, and on certain days wrote the register entries. She added a word not instead of obedience, but next to it, Sister Sabine, obedient and at peace. It was a seam small enough to pass inspection, large enough to let air through. You cannot change a language in a day, but you can alter its weather, a pressure drop here, a breeze that no one ordered there until the climate remembers rain. The burn scar and the blessing. A final vignette. In a village outside Chartres, a woman named Eloise had a burn scar along her wrist from the day she tried to steam away her fear with a kettle too near. Someone had told her that purifying smoke would drive the evil out. It drove only a blister up instead. Isabel saw the scar and did not scold. She taught Eloise to place the pot further, to wrap the towel thicker, to press the heat where the belly listened. Eloise trembled, then cried, then laughed, embarrassed by joy. When the priest asked a month later how her purification fared, she said, with a new steadiness, "I am at peace. It was not a confession and not a defiance. It was the truest sentence the village grammar could carry without breaking. A door to the next room. By now, the patterns are clear. In convents, care moved in a disciplined shadow. In cottages, it hid behind priestly words. In city clinics, it wore Latin that turned women into exhibits. Midwives learned to smuggle relief under neutral names. Nuns learned to write peace inside obedience. The institutions did not extinguish care. They curated it, priced it, renamed it, and took credit for its light. Still the light leaked. The next room in our story belongs to the men of the universities, the physicians whose seals and syllables made them masters of women's bodies. There the stage grows brighter, the audience larger, and the line between healing and spectacle thinner than skin. Male physicians and intrusive examinations. The city of Montpellier stirred with life as dawn broke. Students hurried through the narrow streets parchment tucked under their arms, debating in Latin about Aristotle and Galen. Their destination was the great hall of medicine, a place where bodies became lessons. Inside the benches groaned under the weight of eager young men. At the centre of the vaulted chamber stood Master Guillaume Robes, heavy with the dust of authority. Before him sat Blanche, a merchant's wife, whose pale face betrayed sleepless nights. She had been brought by her husband, who believed her fainting spells came from a wandering womb. Guillaume raised a hand. Observe carefully for her case. Illustrates the movement of vapours. You will learn not only the diagnosis, but the cure. An apprentice lit a brazier releasing acrid smoke of rosemary and rue. Blanche coughed, tears streaming. Guillaume pressed his hands on her abdomen, manipulating firmly. She trembled, a low moan escaping her lips. The apprentices scribbled, expulsio vaporis correctio, achieved. For them it was proof of learning. For Blanche it was humiliation, her suffering turned into spectacle. Latin as shield. Latin transformed the intimate into the respectable. A physician's probing became manipulatio ad correctionem. A woman's cry was noted as obedientia. The language concealed what truly happened, turning pain and involuntary release into evidence of theory. A widow in Paris whispered once to her confessor, "He touched me like cattle at market." When I wept, he said, the humours were leaving. Her words were never recorded. But the physician's neat Latin notes, patient relieved womb corrected, were copied into university archives. His voice lived. Hers died in silence. The apprentice's lesson. In Bologna, a young apprentice noted his master's treatment. The woman's name was never written. She lay rigid, clutching the sheet. The physician pressed and probed. Her body shook, then fell limp. The apprentice wrote, correction successful. Obedience obtained. No mention of her tears, the way she begged for it to end. In the textbook of history, she disappeared in the very moment her body spoke loudest. Knowledge stolen, knowledge rebranded. Much of what physicians did was borrowed from midwives, fumigation massage herbs. But in lecture halls, these remedies were stripped of their origins and wrapped in Latin. What had been the tender knowledge of women became the prestige of men. Where a midwife whispered comfort, a physician lectured. Where a healer's purpose was relief, a scholar's purpose was demonstration. The patient as spectacle. In Padua, a chronicler described a woman placed on a stool in front of dozens of students. Her shift clung to her skin as smoke curled around her. She moaned the hall, leaning forward as though at a play. The physician narrated every tremor. See, the womb resists. See, the womb descends. The students applauded his explanation. The woman's body had become a stage. Her pain was the performance, her relief the proof of his theory. When the lesson ended, she was dismissed to return to her life, carrying humiliation that no one wrote down. Vignette Marguerite of Paris. Marguerite, the daughter of a baker, was taken to a physician's hall after fainting in her father's shop. She had hoped for rest, perhaps a kind word. Instead, she found herself surrounded by robed men. Before she spoke a word, the physician declared, "The womb has strayed." He ordered fumigation hands, moving with routine detachment. Marguerite gasped, her body betraying her. The students scribbled furiously. Later, the physician's notes described her as obedient. At home, Marguerite could no longer meet her father's eyes. She had not been a patient, she had been a lesson. Curiosity and cruelty. Not all physicians intended cruelty. Many believed sincerely in their theories, but the structure of their training turned compassion into curiosity. The more unusual the reaction, the greater the prestige. Trembling confirmed their diagnosis, sighs proved their treatment. Women's bodies were harvested for data, not comfort. Even physicians who pitied their patients wrote of them in terms that erased them, expelled vapors, corrected womb's obedient behavior. The language excused the act, and the act justified the language. The rain-slicked streets of Paris glistened with lantern light, as Marguerite, a merchant's daughter, was led by her father into the university. She clutched her shawl tight every step, echoing with dread. The hall she entered was crowded, not with healers, but with young men, eager for spectacle. The physician spoke in Latin before even asking her name. "Suffocatio matricis," he announced. "The womb obstructs her breath. Correction required." The words struck Marguerite like a sentence passed. She sat on the stool, trembling, as assistants brought the brazier. Smoke coiled around her skirts, stinging her eyes. She coughed, chest heaving. The physician pressed firmly on her abdomen, narrating every reaction like a lecturer reading from a text. Marguerite gasped, a sob slipping free. The students wrote, "Patient obedient after correction." Her voice was never recorded. Only his Latin remained. Bologna's Marble Hall. In Bologna, the marble lecture hall stood as a monument to learning. Yet beneath the painted saints and vaulted ceilings, bodies like Anna's became lessons. She was a washerwoman, thin and stooped from years of labour. Her fainting spells had drawn the attention of a patron eager to sponsor a case for the students. Anna was placed on a high platform so every scholar could see. The physician instructed, watch her pulse, her trembling, her breath. He pressed her body with clinical detachment. Anna shook, moaned, and turned her face to the wall. The hall filled with murmurs of fascination, not compassion. The apprentice beside him noted carefully, obedience achieved, vapours expelled. The marble walls echoed with theory, but Anna's shame sank silently into her bones. The widow's story. Not all patients were poor. In Oxford, Lady Eleanor, a widow of some wealth, consulted a physician for bouts of melancholy. She had hoped for counsel or rest. Instead, she was placed in a small chamber before two young scholars who assisted the doctor. They spoke over her in Latin, describing her as if she were a specimen pinned beneath glass. One student touched her wrist too long. Another commented on the languor of the womb. Lady Eleanor felt her cheeks burn hotter than any fever. When the session ended, the physician pronounced her restored by correction. The widow left with her dignity shattered. She never sought another physician again, telling her maid only, "I went to seek comfort and returned with none." The weight of Latin. Latin gave physicians authority that few dared to question. The common people could not understand it. The clergy endorsed it as the language of the learned. Thus, a woman's cry was erased, translated into phrases like obedientia demonstrata or correctio completa. What was once deeply personal became abstracted into terms that served the prestige of men. The more detached the vocabulary, the more legitimate it appeared. Vignette Isabel of Padua. Isabel, a silk spinner from Padua, suffered convulsions that frightened her family. She was taken to the university infirmary, where a circle of students watched her examination. The physician instructed, "Note how the womb resists correction." Isabel's body jerked violently as the fumigation burned beneath her. She cried out, but her cry was treated as proof of diagnosis. When she collapsed into exhausted stillness, the physician declared, "The womb has descended." The students scribbled. Isabel's voice dissolved in ink that did not belong to her, from healing to harvest. The rise of universities transformed women from patients into resources. Their suffering was harvested for data, their relief repackaged as evidence. The more unusual the reaction, the greater the triumph for the physician. Compassion became curiosity. Dignity became a lesson. Even physicians who pitied their patients rarely broke from the system. To survive in the guild, they had to produce records, and records demanded the language of obedience and correction. A scene in Oxford. A farmer's wife named Agnes was brought to Oxford's medical school. She sat stiffly, her hands gripping her apron. The physician ordered a student to conduct the fumigation while he narrated. Agnes gasped, tears streaking her cheeks. The student blushed, embarrassed, but did not stop. The physician noted her trembling with satisfaction. "The vapours have fled," he declared. When Agnes returned home, she avoided her neighbour's eyes. Her husband, however, boasted that the scholars had cured her. His pride was built on her shame. Silence beyond the chamber. The consequences stretched far beyond the examination halls. Women began to fear physicians, whispering warnings to each other. Better to see the midwife than to face the scholars. Some avoided treatment altogether, choosing pain over humiliation. Others submitted only because their families insisted. But always, the written record favoured the physician's voice. His notes were preserved, cited, admired. The woman's protest dissolved into the air. The apprentice who questioned. Not every student accepted the system blindly. In Bologna, one apprentice wrote in the margin of his notes, "She wept throughout." This was not obedience, but despair. His master later crossed it out, scolding him for sentimentality. "A physician must observe, not indulge," he said. That apprentice never became a master. His career faltered. The system rewarded detachment, not compassion. The erased margin note lay forgotten, a ghost of honesty buried under Latin discipline. The broader pattern. Across Europe, from Paris to Padua, from Oxford to Montpellier, the pattern repeated. Women entered chambers hoping for healing and left diminished. Their bodies were read like texts, but never allowed to author a single line. The institutions preserved only one voice, the male physician's. His words outlived the cries, sighs, and trembling that had filled the room. In archives today, we find endless entries of purified, corrected, obedient. Rarely do we glimpse the truth behind them. The medical halls themselves seemed complicit in the drama. In Paris, the vaulted ceilings carried every moan, amplifying it, as if the stones themselves wished to remind the students of the body before them. The odour of burning herbs clung to the benches, seeping into wool robes until the whole hall reeked of medicine and fear. When a patient cried, the sound bounced from wall to wall, leaving her nowhere to hide. The students reacted in ways that revealed the clash between learning and empathy. Some scribbled furiously, determined not to miss a single observation. Others blushed, shifting uncomfortably, but did not dare look away, lest they be accused of weakness. A few laughed nervously, disguising their discomfort as mirth. None dared to object. The hierarchy of the room demanded silence from anyone who was not the master. Vignette: the noblewoman's display. In Padua, a case was prepared with unusual pomp. The patient was a young noblewoman, daughter of a local patron who had donated funds to the university. Her fainting fits had worried her family, and bringing her to the lecture hall was seen as both a cure and a favour to the institution. She entered with her head held high, determined to preserve dignity. But the moment the physician began, his examination dignity unravelled. Her veil was lifted, her gown loosened. Dozens of male eyes fixed upon her, their gazes, not of desire, but of calculation. Every twitch, every gasp was recorded as data. The physician narrated with, "Flourish, observe the ascent of vapours. See how correction descends through applied pressure." He pressed upon her abdomen, forcing from her a low cry. The noblewoman bit her lip until blood rose, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. When it ended, applause rippled through the students. To them, it was a successful demonstration. To her, it was humiliation sanctified by Latin. That night, she refused food and spoke little, telling her maid only better an untreated illness than such a cure. The machinery of reputation. Cases like hers enhanced reputations. A physician who could stage a dramatic correction before students was more admired, more likely to secure wealthy patrons. Each patient's body became a stepping stone for ambition. Relief was secondary. The paradox grew sharper. The more distressed a woman appeared, the more convincing the cure seemed. A trembling cry proved the womb had resisted. Collapse proved it had been subdued. The patient's suffering was twisted into evidence of the physician's genius. Contrasting the universities. The pattern spanned Europe, though each city shaped it differently. Paris prized spectacle. Physicians emphasized public demonstrations, turning the hall into theatre. Bologna valued precision. Their records were meticulous, reducing women to measurements of pulse and breath. Oxford blended piety with science, insisting examinations began with prayers, though the sanctity of the words did little to soften the invasiveness that followed. Padua cultivated drama, believing vivid demonstrations inspired loyalty in students and patrons alike. Yet beneath these differences, the result was the same women left diminished, while the men who examined them rose in prestige. The layer of silence. Outside the university's whispers travelled. Women warned each other. The scholars will look more than they heal. Midwives urged their neighbours to avoid the halls unless absolutely necessary. Some families listened. Others believed too deeply in the authority of the gown and the Latin tongue. But the silence was not only communal, it was also personal. Many women never confessed what they endured, not even to close kin. The shame was too sharp, the memory too raw. The physicians wrote pages. The patients carried silence. The echo of those examinations did not end in the lecture halls. They carried into homes, marriages, and the very way women understood their own bodies. A peasant girl who had once cried in front of a dozen students might later endure her symptoms in silence, preferring pain to another humiliation. A widow who had been displayed before scholars might refuse further treatment, accepting decline rather than risking her dignity again. For men, the system built careers. For women, it left scars that no parchment recorded. The household after the hall. Consider Jean, a farmer's wife in Normandy. She had been taken to Paris for an examination after weeks of dizzy spells. The physician pressed, fumigated, and declared her corrected. Her husband returned home proud, telling neighbours the scholars themselves tended to her. But Jean no longer laughed in company. She avoided gatherings, worked in silence, and never again sought medical help. Her husband spoke of cure. She lived with shame. The household carried two versions of truth, but only his reached the parish records. Vignette: the weaver's silence. In Florence, a young weaver named Caterina collapsed at her loom. Brought to the university, she endured examination before a semicircle of students. When she cried out, the physician narrated her pain as though it were a diagram. Years later, neighbours remembered her as a quiet woman who rarely left home. They whispered she had never been the same after the cure. In guild records, her productivity declined, her wages cut. The physician's notes, however, lived on in the archives. Correction successful. When knowledge overpowered compassion. The tragedy was not that physicians lacked knowledge. On the contrary, they were brilliant in anatomy, humours, and theory. The tragedy was that their brilliance overshadowed compassion. Each reaction of the patient was stripped of meaning and reinterpreted through doctrine. A tremor became confirmation of theory. A sob became evidence of obedience. Relief, when it came, was not credited to her resilience, but to the physician's technique. The body spoke. The system translated. The woman vanished. A confessor's doubt. One story preserved in letters tells of a confessor in Paris who attended a medical demonstration. He wrote afterward, "I saw a woman examined in such a manner that her tears seemed more of sorrow than of cure. Yet all around me praised the physician. I wondered if learning itself might blind men to mercy." His doubt was rare. Most clergy supported physicians, believing their methods aligned with divine order. Still, the confessor's words remind us that not everyone was deaf to women's cries. Vignette: Arnaud's commission. In London, a noble commissioned physicians to treat his young wife, who often fainted during feasts. She was taken to a chamber where torches burned brightly, casting long shadows across the bed where she was laid. Students watched as her gown was loosened and fumigation applied. She struggled, gasping her face, flushed with heat and shame. The noble stood nearby, nodding gravely as the physician explained her every motion. To him, it was proof of medical mastery. To her, it was betrayal. She whispered later to her maid, "I was not treated, but displayed." Her husband recorded the expense proudly in his household ledger. The physician cited the case in his writings. The wife's truth was buried in silence. Beyond the walls. The ripple effects spread through society. Women whispered to each other about what happened in the halls. Some midwives crafted alternative remedies, keeping neighbours away from physicians when possible. Still, the lure of university authority was strong, and families often insisted on consultations that left women diminished. This cycle repeated for generations, building a tradition where medical progress grew on the foundation of women's erased voices. The very universities that shaped Europe's future also carved away parts of women's past. The harvest of silence. What lingers most is the permanence of the written record. A woman's moan vanished in seconds. A physician's note endured for centuries. The archives preserve Latin phrases of obedience, but not the lived experience. History remembers the gloss, not the truth. The imbalance is stark. One side immortalized in ink, the other fading into whispers. And yet, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the echoes between the lines, the tremors, the protests, the moments of despair that parchment refused to keep. Bridge to the next chapter. From the smoky chambers of universities, where physicians claimed authority over women's bodies, the logic spread into private life. Doctors and priests alike began to argue that the greatest cure for women's ailments was not herbs, not fumigation, not manipulation, but marriage itself. The husband's embrace was prescribed as medicine binding intimacy to duty, desire to doctrine. The stage was set for the next transformation, where the conjugal bed would be reframed as the ultimate treatment. If this journey through the lecture halls of medieval medicine has opened your eyes to the hidden struggles women endured, stay with us. Here at Gentle Historian Medieval Life, we bring forward the voices history tried to erase. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Together we will continue uncovering the forgotten truths of the Middle Ages, one story at a time. Marriage as medicine. The echo of the medical halls did not fade when women left the universities. Instead, their lessons spilled into sermons, confessionals, and the marriage bed. By the 13th century, physicians and priests alike began to insist that the ultimate cure for female disorder was not merely fumigation or massage, but the embrace of a husband. Marriage itself was reframed as a remedy binding medicine to morality and turning intimacy into obligation. Theology meets physiology. Theologians argued that women by nature were prone to imbalance, excess humours, restless desires, wandering wombs. Physicians agreed. The solution, they declared, was regular marital relations. Priests began to echo the claim a wife's body would find harmony through her husband's authority, her womb anchored by his seed. It was a convenient doctrine. What might have been seen as female ailment became justification for male access. In treatises, physicians wrote of natural corrections achieved in the conjugal bed. Confessors preached that denying one's husband was not only sin, but also unhealthy. The language of cure merged seamlessly with the language of obedience. Vignette: The Carpenter's Bride. In a small village outside Rouen, a carpenter named Denis took pride in his new marriage. His bride Colette was 16, thin as a reed and shy. On their wedding night, she trembled not from passion, but fear. Denis remembered advice from the parish priest. Her ailments, if she has them, will vanish in your arms. Marriage is her medicine. He approached with a mixture of duty and desire, believing himself healer as much as husband. Colette lay still, enduring the ritual with clenched teeth. Days later, when she complained of stomach pains, Denis repeated what the priest had told him. It is your body adjusting to its cure. Her voice of discomfort was silenced by the claim of medicine. What she experienced as pain, others interpreted as proof of healing. Physicians reframed the bed. Physicians in Montpellier and Paris began to write openly about sexual relations as therapeutic. They described the husband's role as essential, prescribing marital duty, as if it were a tonic. A text from Bologna claimed, "For ailments of suffocation and hysteria, the proper and most natural correction is union with her husband, frequent and moderate." The words disguised coercion as care. A wife could not easily refuse without seeming both sinful and sickly. Her body was no longer her own. It was bound to the dual authority of physician and priest embodied in the figure of her husband. Vignette: Lady Beatrice. In the manor house of an English lord, Lady Beatrice suffered long bouts of melancholy. She confided in a visiting physician, hoping for herbs or a tincture. Instead, he counselled her husband, "My lord, her humours are unsettled. She must receive you more often. It will restore her balance." The lord agreed, readily proud to be cast in the role of healer. Beatrice, however, wept alone in her chambers. Her desire for space was recast as illness, her reluctance as disobedience. When she resisted, her husband reminded her of the physician's words, "Would you choose sickness over health?" The advice gave him license, cloaking his demands in medical legitimacy. The spread of doctrine. Such teachings spread quickly. Parish priests repeated them in sermons. Confessors advised wives that reluctance endangered their health and their souls. Manuals for confessors even instructed, if a woman refuses, her husband remind her that illness may follow. The marital debt is owed not only for virtue, but for vitality. Thus, the household itself became an extension of the medical chamber. The same logic that had turned fumigation into correction now turned marital intimacy into prescription. A merchant's household. In Florence, a merchant's wife named Alessandra often fainted during hot summers. Her husband consulted a physician expecting herbs. Instead, the doctor advised, "She must not neglect her duty to you, for neglect inflames the womb." When Alessandra begged for rest, her husband reminded her of the warning. "Better to endure me than to endure illness," he said. She submitted her autonomy, eroded by the weight of medical authority. For the merchant, it was reassurance. For Alessandra, it was resignation. In guild records, the merchant was praised for his concern for his wife's health. Her version never reached parchment. Marriage as discipline. By making marriage medicine society turned private intimacy into public obligation. A woman's refusal was no longer simply resistance. It was reframed as dangerous to her health and sinful to her soul. Husbands emboldened by priests and physicians claimed their rights with the zeal of healers. Women who complied were praised as virtuous and healthy. Women who resisted were scolded as stubborn or even accused of inviting illness upon themselves. What was once a matter of personal choice became codified as therapy, discipline, and duty all at once. The double bind. For many women, this created a cruel paradox. If they submitted, they might endure unwanted encounters, their voices silenced by claims of medicine. If they resisted, they faced accusations of disobedience and warnings of illness. Either path denied them agency. The doctrine thus achieved what neither fumigation nor manipulation could fully secure: a system where the husband's authority extended into every corner of his wife's body, sanctified by both theology and medicine. The doctrine of marriage as medicine did not remain in the lofty halls of universities or the pages of theological treatises. It seeped into everyday life, shaping the way families, priests, and even women themselves understood the rhythms of their existence. The parish pulpit. On a damp spring morning, the villagers of Saint-Denis gathered for Mass. Father Guillaume ascended the pulpit, his voice echoing through the nave. After speaking of Lent and charity, he turned to the matter of marriage. "Wives," he intoned, "know that your bodies are gifts, not only to your husbands, but to God. To refuse your marital debt is to invite illness and discord. To embrace it willingly is to ensure health, peace, and divine blessing." The congregation nodded. Husbands glanced toward wives. Wives lowered their eyes. What was framed as spiritual teaching carried a powerful subtext. Marital duty was therapy, and refusal was sickness. Vignette: the miller's wife. Helene, the wife of a miller, listened to the sermon with a knot in her stomach. She had spent nights inventing excuses to avoid her husband's rough advances. Now the priest's words rang in her ears. Refusal was not only sin, but also a danger to her health. That evening, when her husband pulled her toward their bed, she did not resist. She whispered, "For my health, then, though inside she felt only dread. Her compliance was praised in confession the following week. The priest told her, "You are wise to obey. Your obedience keeps you well." Her silence was counted as health, her submission as cure. Physicians prescribing marriage. Doctors, too, began to echo this logic. In a manuscript from Paris, a physician wrote, "For women plagued by vapours and suffocations, frequent union with their husbands is the best preventative." In Bologna, another text claimed, "The conjugal act disperses stagnant humours and prevents hysteria." Thus the marriage bed became medicalized. What was once private now bore the weight of scientific authority. Husbands could claim they were not merely fulfilling desire, but enacting a prescription. Wives who objected seemed irrational, even self-destructive. Vignette: The Merchant of Ghent. A merchant in Ghent once summoned a physician for his wife's frequent headaches. After a brief conversation, the physician declared she must attend to her marital duty more faithfully. Neglect causes imbalance. The merchant left the consultation satisfied. His wife Catherine left in despair. That night, when he insisted on her compliance, she whispered, "I am too tired." He replied with the physician's authority, "Would you defy both doctor and husband? Do you wish to fall more ill?" Her voice vanished beneath the weight of prescription. Confessional pressure. Confession became another instrument of reinforcement. Manuals advised confessors to remind women that refusal endangered both body and soul. A woman who admitted reluctance was urged to submit for her own good. The confessional, meant to be a place of solace, became another chamber of discipline. One surviving record from a Franciscan friar recounts advising a woman better to endure your husband's embrace than to endure the devil's tricks through illness. Her choice was framed as stark comply or risk spiritual and physical ruin. Vignette: The Silent Nun. Even convents were not immune to the rhetoric. A nun in Naples, plagued by fainting fits, was told by a visiting confessor that her illness was proof of her unnatural state. "If you had married," he said, "your body would not rebel. The womb demands its cure." She wept, trapped in a life chosen for faith, but condemned by doctrine as unhealthy. Her suffering became ammunition for those who saw celibacy as dangerous for women. Marriage was cast as the universal solution, even for those who had renounced it. Daily reinforcement. These messages filtered into every corner of life. Mothers advised daughters on their wedding nights, "Endure it, for it will keep you well." Midwives repeated the refrain when asked for remedies. "Better your husband's arms than my herbs." Even neighbours whispered, "A wife who resists too often invites sickness." Over time, the refrain took root so deeply that some women began to internalize it. They told themselves that reluctance was weakness, that submission was strength. What began as doctrine hardened into self-discipline. Vignette: A peasant's resolve. In a village outside Bologna, Lucia confided to her friend, "I dread him at night. But if I refuse, they say I will fall ill. Better to endure than to sicken." Her friend nodded gravely. Both had heard the same sermons. Both had seen neighbours scolded for reluctance. Together, they convinced themselves that obedience was not only virtue, but survival. Their solidarity, born of fear, reinforced the very system that oppressed them. The double authority. Marriage as medicine carried a unique power because it blended two unassailable authorities, the physician and the priest. To resist was to challenge both science and faith. Few dared to defy either. Husbands armed with this dual authority claimed their rights with unprecedented confidence. Women who protested were dismissed as stubborn, ungrateful, or even mad. The system allowed no room for alternative narratives. Illness was cured by compliance. Refusal was itself an illness. Seeds of quiet resistance. And yet, not all women accepted the doctrine silently. Some sought herbs in secret, preferring midwives' remedies to the marital cure. Others found excuses, pretended illness, prolonged prayers, or separate beds during menstruation to carve out moments of reprieve. These acts of resistance were small, fragile, often invisible to the record. But they reveal that even within the stranglehold of doctrine, women sought ways to reclaim fragments of autonomy toward a new normal. By the late Middle Ages, the idea that marriage was a woman's medicine had become so entrenched that it seemed natural, unquestionable. Sermons, treatises, and household practices all repeated it until it became truth by repetition. The household became the hospital, the husband the healer, the wife the patient who could never truly refuse her treatment. The doctrine of marriage as medicine crept so deeply into medieval life that it reshaped even the language families used to speak about health. What once had been described in terms of pain, exhaustion, or longing was increasingly reframed in terms of obedience, duty, and cure. A wife's reluctance could not be simple preference. It had to be treated as disorder. A husband's insistence was not merely desire. It was reimagined as benevolent care. The merchant's ledger. In Bruges, a merchant kept detailed household accounts. Among the purchases of spices and cloth one entry read consultation with physician for my wife's weakness. The advice recorded in the margin, she must fulfill her marital duties more frequently. The merchant wrote in his ledger, afterward, correction administered. Wife much improved. Nowhere was the wife's voice recorded. Did she feel better or worse or broken in spirit? The ledger preserved only his perspective, casting intimacy as treatment and compliance as recovery. Vignette, the baker's daughter. Marie, daughter of a baker in Tours, grew pale and faint during the heat of summer. Her mother took her to a local midwife who brewed teas and advised rest. But when her father consulted a physician visiting from Paris, the advice was starkly different. She needs marriage soon. A husband's care will stabilize her. Marie blanched when she heard the words. She was 15. Yet her parents nodded, convinced that wedlock was the cure. Within a year she was married off to a cooper twice her age. Her dizziness did not vanish. It grew compounded by dread. In her father's mind, he had followed medical advice. In Marie's life, she had exchanged one ailment for another, far heavier. Clerical reinforcement. The church reinforced such practices. Confessors reminded women that withholding themselves risked illness. Bishops encouraged priests to remind couples that marital debt was not only sacrament, but also safeguard against female malady. Marriage was praised from the pulpit as both holy and healthy. One bishop wrote, "If a wife grows pale and listless, it is often because she has denied her husband. Her cure lies in obedience." This teaching trickled down into every confessional booth and every marriage sermon until it shaped expectations so thoroughly that refusal itself seemed unnatural. The quiet resentment. Yet resentment brewed quietly. Some women whispered complaints to midwives, admitting they dreaded the nightly cures. Others sought herbs that dulled desire or excused absence from the marital bed. Recipes for cooling potions circulated in secret remedies, meant not to inflame, but to suppress. These quiet acts of defiance rarely left written trace, but oral tradition preserved them in kitchens, gardens, and whispered confidences. A midwife's notebook from Siena mentions in coded words, "For the wife who suffers too much of the conjugal act, a draught of mint and willow." This was her discreet way of acknowledging pain while protecting herself from accusation. Vignette A. Noblewoman's Rebellion. Lady Isolde of Bavaria, wed at 17 to a count, endured years of what physicians praised as her cure. Her health, however, declined. She grew thinner, withdrawn, fearful of nights. When another physician was summoned, he repeated the same refrain. Her melancholy will pass with regular marital embrace. Isolde finally confided in a lady-in-waiting. If this is health, then health is worse than sickness. She began feigning prolonged prayers and pilgrimages to escape her husband's bed. Her servants aided her, claiming she was fasting or ill. These small rebellions granted her nights of solitude, even as the official narrative still claimed she was improved by marriage. The language of authority. The strength of the doctrine lay in language. Words like correction, obedience, and restoration transformed deeply personal acts into medical prescriptions. By repeating these terms, physicians and priests made resistance sound irrational. To object was to appear not only sinful but also unhealthy. Men adopted this language eagerly. A husband could frame his demand not as desire but as necessity. A wife's reluctance could be dismissed as ignorance of her own well-being. Authority grew not from intimacy but from vocabulary across social classes. Marriage as medicine spanned all ranks of society. For peasants, it justified husbands who claimed their rights without pause. For merchants, it became a rationalization written into ledgers and family records. For nobles, it offered a veneer of legitimacy, allowing lords to see themselves as healers of their wives. For the clergy, it reinforced sermons about order, obedience, and divine design. The universality of the doctrine made it seem natural, even inevitable. Few questioned it, because it touched everyone from hut to manor. Vignette A farmer's bargain. A farmer in Flanders once quarrelled with his wife, who had grown distant after childbirth. When she resisted his advances, he marched to the parish priest. The priest listened, then said, "Remind her it is for her health as much as yours." That night, the farmer repeated the priest's words. His wife wept silently, knowing she had no ally. Her tears were unseen, but her compliance was praised the following Sunday, when the priest remarked she looked much improved. The bargain was clear. Her silence purchased harmony at the cost of her own voice. Normalization through repetition. Over decades, repetition forged permanence. Children grew up hearing mothers, fathers, priests, and physicians repeat the same lesson. Marriage was cure. By adulthood, many accepted it unquestioningly, never realizing it had been constructed rather than discovered. Even women who felt trapped sometimes explained their own suffering in the same terms. "I must endure for my health," they would say, echoing the very doctrine that bound them. The power of repetition reshaped reality itself. By the late Middle Ages, the notion that marriage was a woman's remedy had woven itself so tightly into culture that it was no longer questioned. Physicians cited it, priests preached it, husbands enforced it, and wives endured it. What began as theory had hardened into truth by repetition. The Scholar's Treatise. In 15th century Padua, a scholar compiled a treatise on women's ailments. His conclusion was unequivocal. All disorders of suffocation, melancholy, and weakness are best corrected by regular union with the husband. He cited cases from Paris, Bologna, Oxford, layering them as evidence. What he omitted were the women's own words, the tears, reluctance, and despair. Generations of students copied his lines, absorbing them as fact. Each reproduction buried women further under layers of scholarly authority. Vignette: The Midwife's Protest. Not all remained silent. In a village near Siena, a midwife named Francesca challenged the doctrine openly. She told neighbours, "A husband is no medicine. Herbs rest prayer, these heal. Not a man's demands." Her words spread quietly, but soon the parish priest denounced her. "She defies both church and medicine," he thundered from the pulpit. Within weeks, Francesca faced charges of superstition. She was spared formal punishment only because villagers defended her. Yet her reputation was scarred, and her warning faded into whispers. Her resistance, though brave, became another example of how fragile defiance could be when set against entrenched power. The weight on women. For women, the doctrine carried daily consequences. Many entered marriage with fear, knowing their reluctance could be cast as illness. Others submitted, silently convincing themselves that endurance was virtue. The line between healing and coercion vanished. In households across Europe, wives who sought privacy were scolded. Those who resisted were chastised, and those who complied were praised as healthy. Their lived experiences, pleasure, pain, or indifference, were irrelevant. What mattered was obedience. Vignette A. Countess's Confession. In the court of Burgundy, a countess confessed to her chaplain that she dreaded her husband's nightly visits. "I feel weaker, not stronger," she admitted. The chaplain replied, "It is the devil that makes you think so. Your cure is in his embrace." The countess left in despair, her truth dismissed as temptation. Her body remained a battleground between her own sensations and the words of men who claimed authority over them. Quiet strategies. Still, women carved out spaces of resistance. Some feigned illness to avoid their husbands. Others clung to prolonged pilgrimages, fasting, or rituals that excused abstinence. Servants sometimes conspired with mistresses claiming their lady was unwell or menstruating to buy her rest. These small acts did not overthrow the doctrine, but they revealed cracks in its foundation. A letter from a Florentine wife to her sister survives coded in metaphor to the medicine. "They prescribe is the very cause of my fevers. I find more peace in solitude than in their cure." Her words, though rare, shine as testimony of resistance. From doctrine to destiny. By binding medicine to marriage society, locked women into a destiny where their health was inseparable from their obedience. Husbands became healers by right priests, became enforcers, and physicians became legitimizers. The system reinforced itself endlessly. Sermons echoed treatises, treatises justified sermons, and households embodied both. The cost was borne by women whose bodies became perpetual patients, never free to define their own health. Vignette The Farmer's Widow. When a widow named Agnes complained of fainting, Fitt's neighbours whispered, if only she had a husband, she would be well. No one considered her grief or poverty. Her ailment was framed as absence of marriage, as if her body itself demanded a man. Agnes never remarried. She lived quietly on the margins. Her illness blamed not on circumstance, but on her refusal to accept the cure. The silence of history. Today, the archives preserve countless references to marriage as medicine. They record priests instructing wives, physicians, prescribing husbands, and men congratulating themselves as healers. What is scarce are the women's own accounts. Their silence fills the spaces between lines, reminding us of what was lost. And yet, fragments remain whispers in letters, coded phrases in midwives' notes, confessions that slipped through clerical filters. These fragments tell us the truth. The system tried to erase that for many women, the so-called cure was another form of suffering. Toward the next transformation, as the medieval world moved toward the Renaissance, the doctrine began to shift again. New ideas about anatomy and reproduction emerged, reframing female health in yet more intrusive ways. But the legacy of marriage as medicine endured, shaping centuries of thought and expectation. From fumigation to manipulation to marital embrace, the pattern was clear. Women's bodies were defined not by their own voices, but by the authorities who claimed to cure them. The legacy of cures and the silence of women. By the close of the Middle Ages, the doctrine that women's ailments could be soothed by the hands of their husbands or corrected through marital duty had spread across Europe like gospel. Physicians, priests, and laymen repeated it so often that it hardened into cultural fact. The wandering womb was no longer just a threat to health. It was a threat to order itself, and marriage was the prescribed cure. A landscape of authority. In every village square and noble hall, the message was clear: to a woman's well-being was bound to her obedience. Priests declared it from pulpits, physicians from lecture halls, husbands from their hearths. Even chroniclers and poets echoed it in passing, weaving the language of cure into their descriptions of women. One popular ballad from Flanders sang of a wife who grew pale until her husband healed her through his embrace. It was meant as jest, but its punchline reinforced the doctrine: intimacy equaled remedy, refusal equaled decline. The household became the theatre of medicine, and the wife its perpetual patient. Vignette: the shepherd's daughter. In Castile, a shepherd's daughter named Inez fainted during a summer feast. Neighbours carried her home, fearful of the wandering womb they had heard priests warn about. The village physician declared she needed rest and marriage. Her father nodded, arranging a union within the month. Inez whispered to her mother, "But I am not ready." Her mother replied, "Better wed than waste away." They say it is the cure. The wedding was not just a family arrangement, it was framed as a prescription. Inez entered her new life, not as a bride of choice, but as a patient handed from father to husband. The medicalization of consent. By reframing marriage as medicine, society reshaped the very concept of consent. A wife could not easily refuse her husband when her refusal was painted as sickness. A daughter could not easily delay marriage when delay was equated with disorder. Choice was erased under the guise of cure. A Parisian physician wrote, "If a woman resists her duty, she resists her health." In that single sentence, centuries of autonomy were swallowed. Vignette: the widow of Mainz. Greta, a widow in Mainz, sought relief for chest pains. The physician examined her, then remarked, "If you remarry, your health will improve." Widowhood dries the humours, marriage revives them. Greta frowned. She had no wish to remarry. Yet neighbours repeated the physician's advice, pressing her toward another union. In their eyes, her independence was not freedom, but malady. She lived alone until her death. But village gossip long claimed her illness lingered because she defied the cure. The conflation of desire and duty. What complicated the doctrine further was the conflation of desire with duty. A husband's appetite was framed as both natural and necessary. A wife's reluctance was framed as both sinful and unhealthy. Between these poles, women were trapped. For some, this meant enduring unwanted intimacy under the illusion of medicine. For others, it meant entering marriages arranged in haste, believing their very bodies demanded it. The line between therapy and coercion blurred until it vanished altogether. Vignette: a pilgrim's complaint. On the road to Santiago de Compostela, a pilgrim woman confessed to a fellow traveller, "I took this journey to escape. At home," they say, "my illness is for lack of a husband's touch. But in his arms, I feel only more ill." Her words spoken in passing survived in a pilgrim's diary. Rare and fragile, they reveal that beneath the weight of doctrine, women still named their suffering in private. Yet their voices rarely reached the archives. The cycle of repetition. Marriage as medicine endured because it repeated itself at every level of society. Priests preached it, husbands enforced it, mothers advised it, and daughters internalized it. It became invisible through ubiquity, a truth so embedded that questioning it seemed absurd. Women who whispered resistance did so cautiously. A wife who admitted reluctance risked being called not only disobedient, but unhealthy. Even allies, midwives, servants, sympathetic confessors spoke in hushed tones, knowing that open defiance could bring censure. From village to court, the doctrine was not confined to peasants. In noble courts, physicians counselled lords that their wives' melancholy stemmed from neglect of conjugal duty. Chroniclers recorded with approval when a noble husband restored his wife through intimacy. In one Burgundian account, a duchess's headaches were said to vanish after a period of greater devotion to her husband. Whether her pain truly eased is unknowable. What we know is how the story was written. The husband was healer, the wife patient, and marriage the universal cure. The further the doctrine spread, the more it seeped into the invisible corners of life. What had once been a theory in medical texts and sermons became dinner table advice, whispered warnings, and bedtime justifications. Women found themselves surrounded by the same refrain, no matter where they turned. The mother's lesson. In a cottage near Rouen, a mother prepared her daughter for marriage. She brushed the girl's hair, plaiting it carefully, while offering words meant to reassure. "Do not fear the wedding night," she said. "It will keep you well. The priest says the body is steadied by a husband's touch." The daughter, little more than 16, asked softly, "But what if I do not want it?" Her mother paused, smoothing the braid. "Want is not the matter. Health is. To resist is to weaken yourself. To endure is to grow strong." The lesson was passed not only in sermons or treatises, but in the intimate rituals of family. Mothers who had endured repeated the same doctrine, sometimes believing it themselves, sometimes merely trying to prepare their daughters for what they could not escape. Vignette: the farmer's complaint. In the Rhineland, a farmer argued with his wife Agnes, who resisted his nightly advances. Frustrated, he went to the village priest. The priest listened, then advised, "Remind her that neglect will sicken her. It is as much for her sake as for yours." That night, the farmer repeated the counsel. Agnes turned her face to the wall, tears streaming silently, while he whispered the priest's words as though they were balm. Her protest was swallowed, her compliance reframed as cure. The expansion to widows and nuns. By the 15th century, the doctrine extended beyond wives to widows and nuns. Physicians warned that celibacy endangered women's health, that the body itself rebelled without marital embrace. A Dominican friar wrote, "The widow who shuns remarriage invites sickness. The nun who resists natural order suffers unnatural vapours." Such statements placed pressure on women who had chosen independence or faith, portraying their decisions as harmful to body and soul. In some cases, widows were urged into marriages they did not want. Nuns faced suspicion when they fell ill, their ailments framed as punishment for defying nature. Vignette: the reluctant widow. Clara of Augsburg lost her husband to plague and wished to remain single. But when she began to suffer fainting spells, neighbours insisted she remarry. "Your body craves its medicine," they told her. She resisted for years, living quietly, but her illness became the subject of gossip. Even after her death, chroniclers recorded her refusal to wed as the cause of her frailty. Her true story, grief, exhaustion, perhaps simple bad health, was erased by the narrative of the cure denied. The courtly version. In noble courts, the doctrine took on a sheen of refinement. Physicians couched their advice in elegant Latin, while poets wove the idea into romantic verse. A husband's embrace was not only duty, but remedy. A wife's reluctance was not only disobedience, but pathology. One chronicler of Burgundy wrote admiringly of a duke who restored his duchess through his nightly devotion, banishing her melancholy. The line was meant as praise, yet beneath it lies the same logic. Her health existed only in relation to his authority, the language of treatment. What made the doctrine powerful was its ability to disguise itself as care. Words like remedy, balance, and correction softened what was in truth coercion. A wife was not ordered but prescribed. A refusal was not rebellion but sickness. The vocabulary blurred the line so thoroughly that even women sometimes adopted it themselves. In confession, some said, "I fulfill my duty for my health." Others reassured daughters, "It will make you strong." The repetition of these words carved deep grooves in thought until compliance felt inevitable. Vignette: the silent resistance. Not every woman accepted the doctrine, even when she appeared to. In Florence, a merchant's wife pretended to embrace her husband's advances, but quietly sought remedies from a midwife. She drank calming teas, feigned menstruation, or claimed headaches to win brief reprieves. Her strategies did not overthrow the doctrine, but they carved out fragments of control. In her silence lay resistance, fragile but real. Across Europe, from Castile to Cologne, from Paris to Prague, the pattern was the same. Sermons praised marriage as cure, physicians wrote of conjugal therapy, families repeated the advice in their homes. Women endured, resisted quietly, or reshaped the narrative to survive. What differed was only the detail. In England, sermons stressed obedience. In Italy, physicians emphasized humoral balance. In Germany, chroniclers praised dutiful wives as models of health. The chorus was universal: marriage heals. The inheritance of silence. For generations, this inheritance of silence passed from mother to daughter. To question was dangerous, to refuse unthinkable. The doctrine left its mark, not only in records, but in the private language of households, shaping intimacy, expectation, and fear. And yet even within this weight, women found ways to whisper truth in diaries, in coded letters, in the trust of friends. These fragments remind us that silence was never absolute. Beneath the doctrine, voices still flickered. By the late 14th century, marriage as medicine was no longer argued, it was assumed. Physicians prescribed it with confidence, priests reinforced it with sermons, and communities whispered it as common sense. Women who hesitated were treated as oddities. Those who resisted were condemned as unhealthy or unholy. The physician's authority. Medical texts described marriage in the same tone they used for herbs or bloodletting. A doctor might recommend rosemary for headaches, phlebotomy for fevers, and a husband's embrace for fainting fits. In Bologna, one physician wrote, "The womb is stabilized by the warmth of the conjugal act, which disperses vapors more effectively than fumigation." Such words gave husbands a powerful tool. They could cloak desire in science, claiming they acted not for themselves, but for their wives' well-being. Physicians rarely considered the possibility of harm. For them, compliance equaled cure. Vignette: the weaver's burden. In Ghent, a weaver's wife named Margareta grew pale after her third child. Exhausted from long hours at the loom and the cradle, she begged her husband for rest. Instead, he brought her to a physician who declared, She must not withhold her duty for neglect, will worsen her weakness. That night when her husband pressed her, she whispered, "I cannot." He repeated the physician's words, "It is for your health." Margareta submitted, though her body cried for respite. Months later, she collapsed at her loom, too frail to work. Neighbours remarked, "She was a dutiful wife, yet still she sickened." No one questioned the cure itself. Communities policing women. The doctrine was not enforced by husbands alone. Entire communities participated. Neighbours gossiped about wives who seemed reluctant mothers-in-law, urged compliance, and confessors probed for signs of resistance. A woman's private life became subject to public scrutiny, justified as concern for her health. In some cases, women who resisted were accused of inviting demonic influence. The wandering womb, once a medical theory, blurred into superstition. Refusal was seen not just as stubbornness, but as danger to the household. Vignette: the suspected wife. In a village near Cologne, a woman named Ursula resisted her husband's demands. Soon neighbours whispered she was possessed. The priest visited, advising her husband to be firm. Through his embrace, her disorder will flee. When Ursula continued to resist, she was taken to confession and warned of both illness and damnation. Her protests vanished under layers of suspicion. To say no was to risk not only a husband's anger, but the judgment of an entire village. The noble courts. Even among nobility, the doctrine reinforced power. In Burgundy, chroniclers praised dukes who restored their duchesses through devotion. A duchess who grew ill was urged to accept her husband's cure. Physicians counselled lords in private, giving medical sheen to what was essentially compulsion. One duchess reportedly wrote to her sister, "They say, my cure lies in his arms, yet each embrace feels like further illness. Still, I must smile, for they all applaud his care." Her letter survived only in fragments, but it reveals the chasm between public narrative and private truth. The burden on widows. Widows bore their own share of pressure. Physicians claimed that a woman without a husband risked imbalance. Families urged widows to remarry for their health. Some did so, reluctantly trading independence for survival. Others resisted, but at the cost of gossip and suspicion. A widow in Florence refused all suitors, living quietly with her daughter. When she later fell ill, neighbours clucked their tongues. If only she had accepted a husband, she would have lived. Her story entered local law not as tragedy, but as warning. Vignette: the abbess's illness. Even women who chose celibacy faced scrutiny. An abbess in Siena suffered recurring fevers. Physicians called to the convent suggested delicately that her state was unnatural. One whispered that marriage would have prevented her ailments. Though she had renounced the world for faith, the world insisted on reading her illness through the lens of conjugal absence. The abbess endured the fevers with prayer, but her sisters recorded bitterly in their chronicle, "They claim our vows make us sick, but we know it is their blindness that afflicts us." A system without escape. For most women, there was no escape from the logic of marriage as medicine. To accept was to endure. To resist was to be condemned. Even silence was interpreted as agreement for the physician's notes, and the priest's sermons spoke over the body's own voice. In this way, intimacy itself was colonized by authority. The household became both hospital and prison, the husband both healer and jailer. Vignette: the candlelit confession. In London, a wife whispered to her confessor, "When he comes to me, I feel weaker, not stronger. Yet he says, it heals me." The confessor frowned, torn between compassion and doctrine. At last he replied, "Child, trust your husband. He acts as your physician." The wife bowed, her head resigned. Her truth dissolved into candlelight, replaced by the confessor's reassurance that compliance was cure. The weight of repetition. The doctrine endured not because it was true, but because it was repeated. Every sermon, every prescription, every whispered piece of advice reinforced it until it seemed beyond question. Women who suffered under its weight rarely left testimony, for to speak was to risk ridicule or punishment. Yet the silence was not absolute. Letters, diaries, and marginal notes reveal flickers of resistance moments when women named their suffering in defiance of the doctrine. These fragments, rare though they are, remind us that beneath the layers of prescription, women still sought to reclaim their voices. The silence that cloaked women's voices did not mean their suffering was absent. It meant their words were translated, reshaped, or erased until only fragments survived. Yet even fragments tell us much. They reveal a world where the language of medicine and the power of marriage intertwined so completely that one justified the other. The burden carried in silence. Consider Anna, a peasant in Swabia. Her health faltered after childbirth, and she begged her husband for respite. Instead, he repeated the physician's counsel. Your body will recover only through union with me. Anna endured her body sagging under the weight of both labour and obligation. Her children remembered her as weary her neighbours, praised her as dutiful, and the parish noted she kept well by serving her husband. The truth that she grew weaker with each passing year never entered the record. Vignette: the Duchess of Milan. In Milan, a duchess was praised in chronicles for her recovery after a period of sadness. The chronicler noted proudly that her husband had taken her into his arms more frequently, thus restoring her spirit. What the chronicle omitted was her private letter to a cousin, where she wrote, "They claim I am healed, but I feel only more burdened. Each embrace they praise feels like another chain." The two accounts sit side by side the public narrative of cure the private truth of captivity. The former became history, the latter remained hidden in family correspondence. Generational inheritance. The doctrine shaped not just marriages, but generations. Mothers taught daughters to endure priests, taught children to obey physicians, trained students to prescribe. Each generation passed on the belief that marriage was not only natural, but medicinal. A girl who resisted was told stories of women who fell sick from neglecting duty. A widow who refused remarriage was warned of frailty. The repetition made fear, hereditary binding families into a cycle that seemed eternal. The spectrum of resistance. Yet resistance never disappeared. Women devised ways to subvert the system. Some sought herbs to dull desire, others leaned on rituals of abstinence, sanctioned by the church periods of fasting pilgrimage or religious observance. These pauses gave them pockets of autonomy, however small. Midwives sometimes played accomplices, offering remedies that soothed rather than inflamed. Servants shielded mistresses by fabricating illnesses. Even confessors, on rare occasions, counselled husbands to show restraint, though they often couched it in terms of moderation rather than rejection. Such acts did not dismantle the doctrine, but they revealed cracks. Women were not simply passive patients. They were agents finding slivers of freedom where they could. Vignette: the Pilgrim's Song. A song recorded in the margins of a pilgrim's diary tells of a wife who escaped her husband's cure by journeying to Santiago. She sang to fellow travellers, "Better the road's hardship than the bed's remedy." Her words may have been jest, but they carried sharp truth. For some, pilgrimage was not only spiritual but bodily relief, the only escape from a doctrine that left no refuge at home. A system of echoes. What made marriage as medicine so enduring was its system of echoes. Priests echoed physicians, physicians echoed priests, husbands echoed both. Women heard the same message from pulpit, bed, and hearth, until it seemed like nature itself speaking. But history shows us the machinery behind the echo. It was not nature, it was design. And designs can be unmade. Toward the Renaissance, as Europe shifted toward the Renaissance, new medical theories emerged focusing on anatomy, reproduction, and the circulation of fluids. Yet the shadow of marriage as medicine lingered. The household remained a site of both intimacy and discipline, the wife still positioned as patient to her husband's cure. The doctrine did not vanish, it evolved. Physicians grew more clinical, but their assumptions about women's dependence persisted. The silence of wives continued to underwrite the authority of men. Vignette, the scholar's wife. In Padua, the wife of a physician confided to a friend. He lectures on cures to his students. And then he comes to me as if I were his lesson. They cheer him in the hall, and I weep in the night. Her lament captures the cruel irony. Even those closest to knowledge were not spared its weight. Authority served itself before it served compassion. The cost of cure. The ultimate cost of marriage as medicine was not merely the suffering of individuals, but the erasure of voices across centuries. Archives preserved physicians' prescriptions, priests' sermons, and men's boasts, but rarely the words of women themselves. Their truths lived in margins, in whispers, in silences, heavy with meaning. Yet silence is not emptiness. It is evidence of suppression, a reminder that beneath the official narrative lay countless untold stories. Bridge to conclusion. From fumigation to manipulation, from marital embrace to widowhood, the story has carried us through the many ways women's bodies were turned into battlegrounds. At every turn, cures were prescribed that silenced more than they healed. And yet in fragments, we still hear the echoes of women who resisted, who whispered, who sought other remedies. Their courage, though fragile, keeps the truth alive. And so we arrive at the end of this journey through medieval medicine, marriage, and the silenced voices of women. Their struggles remind us how power can disguise itself as care, and how truth can survive even in fragments. If this story has stirred your curiosity, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Sleepless Historian, join our quiet circle of listeners, and keep uncovering the forgotten chapters of medieval life. Your support helps bring these voices back to life, stories whispered, not shouted, so they can stay with you long after the fire fades. Stay a while, and let history speak again.